Section 1. The beginning of a mythology. There is something specific about late-night curiosity that pulls you toward the strange corners of things you thought you already knew. You grow up watching a show. You memorize the jokes. You know the characters like old neighbors. And then someone mentions something in passing, a scene that got cut, an episode that never aired, a moment that was quietly removed from history, and suddenly the show you thought you knew completely becomes a little darker, a little deeper, a little more mysterious than it was before. That is what Family Guy does to you when you start pulling on the right threads. Most people know the surface of it. The Griffin family. The cutaway gags. Seth MacFarlane's voice coming out of multiple mouths in the same room. The show that got canceled not once but twice and somehow came back stronger than before. They know it as background noise, as comfort television, as the thing that plays when you need something familiar and low pressure to occupy the edges of a quiet evening. But underneath all of that familiarity, there is an entire body of lost content, restricted footage, controversial decisions, vanished episodes, and creative mysteries that most casual viewers have never heard of at all. The show that premiered on the 31st of January, 1999, after Super Bowl 33 pulling in somewhere around 22 million viewers, that first night has spent the better part of 3 decades accumulating secrets. Some of them were hidden deliberately by the network, cut from broadcast at the last moment because someone in a suit decided the timing was wrong or the content was too hot to handle. Some of them disappeared accidentally, left behind on old hard drives or buried in the portfolios of animators who had moved on to other projects and forgotten what was sitting there. Some of them were pulled out of circulation after real-world events made them suddenly uncomfortable to watch. And some of them have been sitting in the open this whole time, hiding in plain sight inside DVD bonus features and fan forums and the quiet corners of the lost media community, waiting for someone patient enough to go looking. This is going to take a while, and that is exactly the point. We are going to go through all of it slowly, carefully, the way these stories deserve to be told. We are going to start before the show ever existed, when Seth MacFarlane was a young animator with a hand-drawn pitch and $50,000 from a television network that wasn't entirely sure what they were agreeing to fund. We are going to move through the decades, picking up each mystery as we go, turning it over, examining what we know and what we don't, and sitting with the questions that still don't have clean answers. If you are watching this late at night, or listening with your eyes closed, or just letting the words wash over you while you wind down good, that is the right energy for this kind of story. Because the mysteries of Family Guy aren't loud. They aren't the kind of thing that needs dramatic music or urgent pacing. They are quiet, a little melancholy, occasionally fascinating, and deeply human in the way that all stories about creative things eventually become. They are about a show that meant something to a lot of people, and all the strange, imperfect, occasionally messy things that happened in the space between the version of that show that was imagined and the version that actually made it to screen. So, settle in. We are going back to 1998 to a small animation studio and a 6-minute piece of footage that the world wasn't supposed to see for the next 30 years. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing where in the world people are when they find these videos. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's completely free and it helps this channel keep going. Section 2. The Lost Pilot 30 Years in the Dark. The story of the Family Guy pilot that almost nobody saw for 3 decades begins in a very specific moment of creative desperation and ambition. Seth MacFarlane had been working at Hanna-Barbera on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He was young, barely out of art school, and he had already made 2 short animated films on his own, The Life of Larry in 1995 and a follow-up called Larry and Steve that aired on Cartoon Network in 1997. Those 2 shorts featured a clumsy, middle-aged man named Larry and his sarcastic talking dog Steve. And if you watch them now, you can see Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin standing right there in embryonic form, not quite formed yet, but unmistakably headed somewhere specific. Fox saw something in those shorts. They gave MacFarlane $50,000 to produce a pitch pilot, a short animated film that would demonstrate to network executives what a full series might look like. That is not a lot of money for animation. Even in the late 1990s, that budget was lean. But MacFarlane took it and built something remarkable. a 1 6-minute animated episode that introduced the Griffin family, established the show's comedic rhythm, and convinced Fox to greenlight what would become one of the longest-running animated series in television history. That 1 6-minute pitch pilot was not intended for public consumption. It was a working document, a sales tool, a proof of concept. After Fox greenlit the show, the pilot was largely set aside. A slightly revised and significantly more polished version of the same story would eventually be broadcast as the show's official premiere episode, Death Has a Shadow, on January 31st, 1999. The original rough pilot, with its cruder animation and handful of differences from the finished product, quietly disappeared into the archive. For years, only a fragment of it existed in public. A 7-minute portion had been included as a bonus feature on the Family Guy Volume 2 DVD set, released in September 2003. Fans who owned that disc knew those first 7 minutes existed, and a small number of low-quality images from the rest of the pilot had circulated on old fan sites and forums over the years. But the complete 1 6-minute version was considered lost. The Lost Media Wiki, a community dedicated to tracking down media that has vanished from public accessibility, had the pilot listed as a partially found item for years known to exist, impossible to find. Then, in March of 2025, something remarkable happened. An internet user associated with the Lost Media Wiki community discovered that the complete 1 6-minute pilot had been sitting, quietly and entirely publicly, on the personal portfolio website of a man named Robert Paulson, not the voice actor, but an animator who had worked on the pilot doing compositing and digital ink and paint work. Paulson had posted it as part of his professional portfolio, which is the kind of perfectly ordinary thing that makes lost media discoveries feel both astonishing and somehow inevitable. The full pilot had not been hidden in a vault or locked behind corporate doors. It had been posted on the open internet by someone who was proud of the work he had done, and it had simply been sitting there, waiting to be found by someone who thought to look in the right place. The response from the Family Guy fan community when the discovery was announced was significant. The Lost Media Wiki posted about the find in late March 2025, and it spread quickly across social media, picked up by entertainment outlets and cartoon history enthusiasts. People who had spent years casually wondering about the complete pilot suddenly had it sitting in front of them. Watching the full 1 6-minute pilot now is a strange and somewhat moving experience. The animation is noticeably rougher than what the broadcast episodes would have. The character designs are recognizable, but slightly off the proportions aren't quite settled yet. The movements have a certain looseness that comes from an early production where the style hadn't been fully locked down. Lois, in particular, looks slightly different. The whole thing has the quality of something that was made by a small group of very talented people working quickly and with limited resources, which is exactly what it was. The plot closely mirrors what would become Death Has a Shadow, the official broadcast pilot. Peter gets drunk at a stag party and loses his job at the toy factory. He hides this from Lois and starts collecting welfare. Stewie, already building mind control devices in his crib, is already fully formed in terms of his essential character. The contrast between his infant appearance and his articulate villainy is there from the very beginning, which tells you how much of early Family Guy was baked into McFarlane's original concept rather than developed over time. The most immediately striking difference for anyone who watches the pilot is the voice of Chris Griffin. In the broadcast series, Chris is voiced by Seth Green, who by all accounts won the role in a fairly peculiar audition. He has said he did an impression of Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, which McFarlane apparently found perfect. But Green had not been cast yet when McFarlane made the pitch pilot. So Chris, in the 1998 version, is voiced by McFarlane himself. And McFarlane's version of Chris sounds noticeably different, not drastically so, but enough that it underscores how much of the show's final texture came from the specific voices and performers who were eventually assembled around it. There are also a handful of jokes where the punchline is different from what ended up in the broadcast version. The most notable is the ending of the episode, which in the broadcast pilot features a sudden, fourth-wall-breaking appearance by the Kool-Aid Man bursting through the wall, a gleefully absurdist non sequitur that immediately established Family Guy's willingness to abandon narrative coherence for the sake of a good gag. In the pitch pilot, that particular flourish isn't there. The story ends more conventionally, without that signature moment of pure chaos. It's a small difference, but it's revealing. The Kool-Aid Man ending feels like the kind of thing that gets added in the process of a show finding its voice, of someone in a room saying, "What if we just went completely insane here?" and everyone else realizing it's the right call. The discovery of the full pilot matters not just as a piece of cartoon history, but as a window into what a creative person looks like when they are building something for the first time. McFarlane had worked on other people's shows. He had made his Larry shorts. But the pitch pilot for Family Guy was, in a very real sense, the first time he got to make something completely his own with actual production resources behind it. And what he built, even in that rough 1 6-minute form, had the essential shape of what would eventually become one of the most watched animated series in television history. The differences between the pitch pilot and the broadcast pilot are interesting, but what's more interesting is what stayed the same. The relationship between Peter and Brian was right. The basic dynamic of Peter making a mess and his family having to deal with it was right. Stewie's entire character was essentially complete. The spirit of the thing, the combination of family sitcom warmth and sharp, slightly dangerous humor was already there. McFarlane built the foundation of the show correctly on the first attempt, which is rarer than it sounds. Knowing that the full pilot existed but had been functionally invisible for close to 30 years makes you wonder what else might be sitting in someone's portfolio or on an old hard drive somewhere. The universe of lost Family Guy material is larger than most people realize. The pilot was one piece of it, but it is far from the only piece. There are the deleted scenes from the first 3 seasons that have never been released to the public, scenes that exist or are known to have existed, but that didn't make it onto the DVD sets that compiled seasons 4 and beyond. There are animatics and early drafts of episodes that changed significantly between the first outline and the finished product. There are cut gags, alternate endings, scenes that were animated and then pulled for reasons that were never publicly explained. The Lost Media Wiki has a dedicated entry for the partially found deleted scenes from seasons 1 through 3, noting that only 3 scenes from the first season have ever surfaced publicly in old commercials and a behind-the-scenes feature, despite the fact that a typical animated television season almost certainly generates a significant amount of material that doesn't make the final cut. The contrast with seasons 4 and beyond is stark. Starting with the revival in 2005, deleted scenes became a regular feature on DVD releases. You can watch hours of cut material from seasons 4 through the mid-teens. But seasons 1, 2, and 3, the original run, the era that many fans consider the creative peak of the show, remain largely locked away. Whatever ended up on the cutting room floor during those first 3 years is mostly gone from public access. Whether it still exists in archive form somewhere in Fox's holdings, or on the personal computers of the writers and animators who worked on those seasons, or nowhere at all, is genuinely unknown. What we do know is that the show produced in those first 3 years was built by a specific group of people under specific conditions, and that a lot of what made it work didn't survive the cancellation and revival. McFarlane himself was explicit about this. He acknowledged that one of the consequences of the show being canceled and revived was that writers scattered and had to be replaced. New people with different sensibilities came in. The writing room that made seasons 1 through 3 was never fully reassembled. That lost original writing room is its own kind of mystery. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzel, and Mike Barker. These are the names most associated with the original run, and tracking what each of them did before and after Family Guy's first cancellation tells you something about what the show lost when it lost them. Some of them stayed connected to the show in various capacities. Some moved on entirely. What they might have written, what stories they might have told if the show had never been canceled and the original creative team had stayed together, is one of the more quietly haunting what-ifs in the history of the series. The pitch pilot's discovery in 2025 was a reminder that the history of Family Guy is still being uncovered, still being pieced together, 30 years after the show first started. And that history includes not just what was made, but what was almost made, what was made and removed, what was made and never shown, and what was made and shown, but has since been pulled from public view for reasons that range from network sensitivity to genuine tragedy. That last category is one of the most significant parts of the Family Guy mystery story, and it begins with a specific kind of joke in a specific kind of episode that collided with reality in a way that nobody on the writing staff could have anticipated. Section 3. The episodes that never aired. Let's talk about what it means for an episode of television to disappear. In the streaming era, we tend to assume that everything is accessible. If a show exists, you can find it. If an episode was made, you can watch it. The idea that a fully produced, fully animated, fully scored episode of a major network television series might simply not be available anywhere, not on the show's official streaming home, not on DVD re-releases, not through any legitimate channel feels almost anachronistic. Like something from an earlier era of media, when a show could vanish after its broadcast run simply because nobody had captured it. But Family Guy has at least one episode that fits exactly that description. Produced, finished, never broadcast in the United States. And, for much of its history, locked away from any streaming platform. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It is the final episode of Season 8. It was produced in 2009, announced at San Diego Comic-Con that same year, where the Family Guy team told a room full of fans that the episode existed and that Fox had decided not to air it. And it has never appeared on American television. Not on Fox. Not on Adult Swim, which Fox actually pressured to refuse the episode as well. It appeared in the UK on BBC Three in June of 2010, where it aired in its usual primetime slot and was watched by around 1 million households and received generally positive reviews from critics. In the United States, the only legal way to see it was to buy the Season 8 DVD box set, which did include the episode despite it never having been broadcast. The episode deals with surrogacy and, ultimately, abortion. Lois agrees to be a surrogate mother for an old college friend named Naomi and her husband Dale. There is a backstory. Lois and Naomi had a brief romantic history in college, which Peter finds exciting in the way that Peter finds most things involving women exciting, at least until he realizes that Naomi's husband is a man, and the arrangement is purely about carrying a child. Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident partway through the pregnancy, leaving Lois facing a decision about what to do with the baby she is now carrying for parents who are no longer alive. The episode spends its third act as something close to a genuine debate about abortion, not the kind of watered-down, both sides have a point treatment that network television usually deploys when it touches the subject, but a relatively unflinching portrayal of the actual emotional and ethical weight of the decision. Peter changes his position multiple times. Lois is forced to think seriously about something that is, by almost any measure, genuinely hard to think about. The episode doesn't resolve the question definitively. The final scene cuts to black before the choice is made, leaving the audience with the ambiguity rather than a tidy conclusion. Fox's decision not to air it was announced well in advance of what would have been its broadcast date. Fox Entertainment president Kevin Reilly offered a candid explanation at the time, noting that the network was concerned about the economic sensitivity of the moment. This was 2009, during a difficult period for advertising, and Reilly suggested that the subject matter made sponsors uncomfortable enough that the economic calculus didn't work. Seth MacFarlane, by his own account, thought the episode was very good and was frustrated by Fox's decision. He described it as too edgy for the network, though the word edgy feels like an understatement for what the episode was actually attempting. What makes Partial Terms of Endearment particularly interesting as a piece of lost media history is how it reveals the limits of what Family Guy could actually explore despite its reputation for pushing every possible boundary. The show had spent years making jokes about subjects that most networks would not touch at all. It had made jokes about 9/11. It had made jokes about religious figures, about race, about disability, about domestic violence, about things that generated real complaints and real controversy. But a genuine, earnest, somewhat thoughtful engagement with abortion, not a joke about abortion, but an actual story that tried to take the subject seriously, was apparently a step too far. There is something almost poetic about that. A show that built its identity on transgression, on saying things that weren't supposed to be said, on making audiences uncomfortable, and then making them laugh at their own discomfort. That show was silenced, not by a particularly extreme joke, but by attempting something approximating genuine emotional honesty about a difficult subject. The jokes were fine. The earnestness was the problem. If Partial Terms of Endearment is the most formally banned episode in the show's American history, fully produced, never broadcast domestically, Not available for years on any streaming service, it is not the only episode that ran into serious trouble with the network. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was produced in the year 2000, intended to be part of the second season, and then held back by Fox for approximately 4 years before it ever aired. The episode follows Peter developing a friendship with a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein after concluding that Jewish people are inherently better with money. The episode's humor both relied on and gently satirized that anti-Semitic stereotype. Peter's logic was being presented as wrong-headed in the way that much of Peter's logic is wrong-headed, with the episode ultimately concluding that success has nothing to do with religion. But Fox was not convinced in the year 2000 that audiences would receive that framing correctly, and the episode was pulled from the schedule at the last minute. It sat in a kind of limbo for years. It was not broadcast, it was not released on DVD, it was, for a while, simply a known thing that existed but couldn't be seen. The first 7 minutes of the Family Guy pitch pilot, the ones that had been included on the Season 2 DVD, were more accessible than an entire completed Season 3 episode that had been made for broadcast and then locked away. The episode's main musical number, a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, called I Need a Jew, eventually became a legal matter as well. The song's publisher, Born Co., sued Fox and McFarlane in 2007, arguing that the parody harmed the reputation of the original Pinocchio song. A federal judge ruled in Fox's favor in 2009, finding that the parody was protected under fair use doctrine. The lawsuit added another layer of complexity to an episode that had already spent years as a kind of unloved and inaccessible piece of Family Guy history. The episode finally aired on Adult Swim in November 2003 and on Fox in December 2004, years after it was produced, years after it was supposed to be seen. By the time it aired, the context had shifted enough that many viewers found it less offensive and more simply dated than they had expected. The feared anti-Semitism that had caused Fox to hold it back for so long turned out to be, for most viewers, a fairly obvious send-up of anti-Semitism rather than an expression of it. But the story of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein has a layer that most people don't know about. The version of the episode that finally aired on Adult Swim, then on Fox, was not the same as the original version that had been produced and held back. There was an earlier draft, a table read version, that differed from the finished episode in significant ways. References to this earlier draft turn up in DVD commentaries and in a speech that McFarlane gave at an awards event. The Lost Media Wiki has an entry for this early draft, documenting what is known about its contents and what remains unverified. A fan on social media surfaced a copy of the original script in April 2020, posting images of its pages and generating significant discussion in the Family Guy research community. But the full script images were not all legible, and a Google Drive link to a more complete version of the document was later lost. As of this writing, the full contents of the original early draft remain only partially documented. It represents one of the more unusual examples of Family Guy lost media, not a missing piece of animation or a cutscene, but a missing version of a story, an alternate text that shaped the finished episode in ways that are documented only in fragments. The gap between the episode that Fox held back and the episode that finally aired contains its own history. The version that was shelved in 2000 was not the same version that was eventually broadcast. Something changed in the intervening years. Jokes were reworked, perhaps entire scenes were reconceived, and the process of that revision is largely invisible to anyone who wasn't in the room when it happened. Section 4. The Boston Marathon and the episode that fell through time. There is a specific category of censored or restricted media that sits differently from the rest, and it is the category where the content didn't create a controversy by being offensive in the abstract. It created a controversy by being, through terrible timing, connected to a real-world tragedy that nobody involved in making it could possibly have anticipated. Turban Cowboy is the 16th episode of Season 11 of Family Guy. It aired on the 17th of March 2013. It is about Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud after being injured in a skydiving accident. The episode has significant problems of its own. Critics, at the time, pointed out that it depicted Muslim characters in ways that relied heavily on stereotypes, and reviews were largely negative. But none of that is what sent it into a kind of forced disappearance. The episode contains a cutaway gag. This is not unusual. Family Guy episodes of this era contained many cutaway gags, often on subjects that ranged from mildly edgy to quite dark. This particular cutaway showed Peter winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through a crowd of runners. It was a darkly absurdist image of Peter committing vehicular mass murder for the sake of a race, which is the kind of joke that exists in Family Guy's particular comedic vocabulary without necessarily being intended as anything beyond an extreme non sequitur. The episode aired on the 17th of March 2013. Roughly 1 month later, on the 15th of April 2013, 2 pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. 176 people were injured. It was one of the most horrific domestic attacks in the United States in years, and its images, runners crossing the finish line, then chaos, then blood were broadcast continuously across every news network for days. Someone edited a clip. They took the cutaway from Turban Cowboy, showing Peter mowing down runners at the Boston Marathon, and spliced it together with a separate, unrelated scene from the same episode where Peter was shown using a phone to trigger explosions from a distance. The 2 scenes had nothing to do with each other within the episode. They were from entirely separate storylines. But edited together, they appeared to show Peter planning and executing a mass bombing at the Boston Marathon. The clip spread rapidly online. Conservative commentator Alex Jones promoted it on his InfoWars platform, suggesting without any basis in fact that the episode had somehow predicted or inspired the actual bombing. McFarlane's response was immediate and unambiguous. He called the edited clip abhorrent on social media, clearly stating that it was a fraudulent splicing of 2 unrelated scenes from separate storylines in the same episode. Fox worked with YouTube to have the manipulated clip taken down. But the damage, in terms of the episode's continued existence in public circulation, was already done. Fox pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com, from Hulu, and from Amazon. The network announced it had no plans to broadcast the episode again. It was pulled from cable reruns. For approximately 9 years, the episode was effectively invisible in the United States outside of physical DVD copies. It was available on the DVD set. It wasn't erased entirely, but none of the legal streaming services that carried Family Guy had it. In September 2022, Hulu quietly restored the episode to its Family Guy library. It returned without fanfare, just slipping back into the chronological episode list as if it had always been there. The episode is now available to stream again. But the 9 years it spent in a kind of streaming purgatory, after the tragedy in Boston and the conspiracy theory and the network's decision to remove it, represent one of the stranger chapters in the show's relationship with its own content. What makes the Turban Cowboy situation particularly interesting from a media history perspective is how it illustrates the difference between content being restricted because of what it actually is and content being restricted because of what it accidentally resembles. Partial Terms of Endearment was held back because of what it genuinely depicted, a real, earnest treatment of abortion. Turban Cowboy was held back because a misleading clip made it briefly appear, to people who hadn't watched the episode, to depict something that it did not in fact depict. The actual content of the episode, a lazy, somewhat offensive episode with too many stereotype jokes about Muslims, was not the reason it got pulled. The fabricated connection to a real bombing was the reason. There is also the matter of the real-world conspiracy theory that attached itself to the episode. Jones and others who promoted the edited clip were not simply making an error, they were actively constructing a narrative in which a cartoon had either predicted or inspired a real terrorist attack. That narrative gained enough traction that it needed to be publicly rebutted. McFarlane having to go on social media to clarify that his show did not predict or inspire a bombing is one of the more genuinely surreal moments in the history of what was, after all, an animated comedy about a dysfunctional family in Rhode Island. The episode's absence from streaming for 9 years, and its eventual return, tells you something about how media institutions think about the relationship between content and real-world events. The initial decision to pull it was a reflexive response to tragedy and manufactured controversy. The eventual decision to restore it was presumably made when enough time had passed that the connection felt historical rather than immediate. Whether 9 years is the right amount of time for that transition is a question nobody seems to have answered explicitly. Meanwhile, other episodes with their own connections to real-world events were handled very differently. The show had long contained references to the 11th of September 2001, some cut out of broadcast versions and later restored, some left in, some added in later seasons as the cultural distance from the event grew large enough that jokes about it became more common. The treatment of 9/11 references in the show's early seasons is its own mini-history of how American television navigated the event's aftermath. Two early episodes, A Picture's Worth 1,000 Words and Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows, contained brief appearances of the World Trade Center towers in their animation. After the attacks, those appearances were edited out of broadcast and rerun versions, replaced with skylines that simply didn't include the towers. This is the kind of edit that feels, in retrospect, more reflexive than considered. The towers were not the point of either scene. They were just background elements of a New York cityscape, and their removal didn't change the episodes at all. But removing them felt like the appropriate gesture at the time, and so the gesture was made. The episode Road to Rhode Island had a different kind of 9/11 edit. That Season 2 episode, which aired in May of 2000, more than a year before the attacks, contained a scene where Osama bin Laden distracted an airport security guard while weapons went through the X-ray machine. The joke was a pre-9/11 joke about airport security being inadequate, an observation about institutional incompetence, not an endorsement of terrorism. After September 2001, the scene was cut from broadcast and rerun versions and also removed from the Family Guy Volume 1 DVD release. It remains intact on the Family Guy Freakin' Sweet Collection DVD, making it one of the more unusual instances in the show's history of the same content being available in some home video releases and not others. The Meet the Quagmires episode from Season 5 contained a deleted scene not in the broadcast version, but included on the DVD where Brian, while traveling back in time to the 1980s, invites a man who has challenged him to a fight to meet him on top of the World Trade Center on the 11th of September, 2001, at 8 in the morning. The joke is dark in a way that was clearly calculated. Brian is giving the most elaborate possible version of a "you'll never show up" challenge, using a date and location that the audience knows will result in the challenger being killed. It did not air in the episode's broadcast version. It exists on the DVD as a piece of deleted content that takes the show's relationship with 9/11 humor about as far as it could go. And then there is the Back to the Pilot episode from Season 10, which takes all of this one step further in a way that is both genuinely funny and slightly unsettling. In that episode, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the events of the show's first episode in 1999. Brian, knowing the future, attempts to warn his past self about the 9/11 attacks. This creates a timeline where the attacks are prevented, which turns out to cause its own cascade of problems. And in the new timeline, Brian eventually shows up at the location of the challenges he issued in the Meet the Quagmires deleted scene, standing on top of the World Trade Center, waiting for a man who is alive in this timeline because 9/11 was prevented, and who absolutely remembered the challenge and showed up to fight. The episode threads the needle between morbid and clever in a way that the show occasionally managed in its middle seasons. It turns the deleted scene from one episode into the punchline of another episode 5 seasons later, which requires the audience to have watched the DVD version of Meet the Quagmires and remembered it. For viewers who had watched only the broadcast versions of both episodes, the reference to the challenge is likely completely opaque. It is a joke that only makes full sense if you have access to material that was cut from broadcast and distributed on physical media. That kind of layered, cross-episode, media format-dependent storytelling is something that Family Guy engaged in more often than it is usually given credit for. Understanding the full version of the show's history requires knowing not just what aired, but what was cut, what ended up on DVDs, what was removed and then restored, and what the relationships are between all those different versions of the same material. Section 5. The Stewie Tapes: The Mythology of an Evil Baby. There is a question that has been passed around Family Guy fan forums and discussion communities since at least the early days of the show's revival, and it goes something like this: who can hear Stewie? On the surface, this seems like a simple question with a clear answer. In the early seasons, most adult characters appeared unable to understand Stewie's elaborate speeches. He would deliver grand monologues about world domination while Lois smiled and handed him a bottle. He would threaten to destroy civilization, and Peter would respond to something else entirely. Brian was explicitly positioned as one of the only characters who could understand and communicate with Stewie, which is part of what made their friendship so unusual and central to the show's early dynamic. But if you watch the early episodes carefully, the answer is messier than it first appears. There are scenes, not errors exactly, but moments that suggest the rules were never fully consistent, where other characters seem to react to things Stewie has said, or where the logic of a scene only works if someone besides Brian can understand the baby talking. The show operated with a flexible internal logic on this point, acknowledging the rule when it served the comedy and quietly ignoring it when a different kind of joke needed the character to be heard. This ambiguity is actually one of the richest veins in the show's early mythology. The question of whether Stewie is audible to the world around him, and to what degree and under what circumstances, became a recurring subject of fan analysis. Different people arrived at different conclusions. Some argued that everyone can hear Stewie, but most adults simply interpret his speech as baby babbling. They hear sounds that they process as meaningless, even though the sounds are fully articulate sentences. Some argued that the show simply wasn't consistent, and that looking for a unified theory is a fool's errand. Some argued that Stewie exists in a kind of superposition, heard or not heard depending on what the scene requires. The writers were aware of the question. In a segment from the direct-to-DVD film Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, there is a moment that directly addresses it. Stewie, visiting his future self, encounters a world where the ambiguity about his audibility has apparently been resolved in one direction or the other. The show's various commentary tracks and interviews contain scattered acknowledgments that the "who can hear Stewie" question was never definitively answered, partly because answering it definitively would have constrained the comedy. MacFarlane's own comments on Stewie's character are worth sitting with here, because they reveal something about how the character's mythology was conceived and then gradually revised. Stewie was designed, in the original concept, to be a one-year-old with the intellect and emotional architecture of a fully formed adult villain. The joke was the contrast: the tiny body, the diaper, the high chair, the baby food, all surrounding a mind that was plotting the end of civilization. MacFarlane has said in various interviews that Stewie's British accent was based on Rex Harrison's voice in My Fair Lady, a specific choice that positioned Stewie as an aristocratic, theatrical villain from the very beginning. The evil baby mythology extended beyond just wanting to kill Lois. Stewie built weapons. He built a full-scale time machine in his bedroom before his second birthday. He constructed mind control devices. He had allies and enemies that nobody in the Griffin household knew about. He was conducting a secret war against humanity from inside a crib, and the show mostly refused to explain how a human infant had developed these capabilities. The lack of explanation was part of the joke, part of the absurdism that made the character work. But there were elements of this mythology that were introduced and then dropped before they could be developed. In the early seasons, there were hints of a larger story around Stewie's suggestions of a destiny, connections to forces beyond the Griffin household, moments that implied the character's evil genius wasn't random but directed towards something specific. Some of these threads were picked up and developed in later episodes. Many were quietly abandoned when the character's direction shifted toward the gentler, more emotionally focused Stewie of the post-revival era. The relationship between Stewie and Lois is the most significant of the abandoned threads. In the first 3 seasons, Stewie's attempts to kill Lois were consistent, escalating, and occasionally terrifying in their specificity. He didn't simply want her dead in the abstract. He had reasons, or at least feelings, that drove the obsession. The show occasionally gestured toward the idea that Stewie's hatred of Lois was connected to something in his psychology, something about being trapped in an infantile body he didn't choose, something about the specific vulnerability of being entirely dependent on someone you have complicated feelings about. None of that subtext was ever fully articulated, because Family Guy wasn't that kind of show, but it was there hovering behind the jokes about laser guns and mind control devices, giving those jokes a slightly uncomfortable edge that pure absurdism wouldn't have had. Stewie wasn't just a funny character. In the early seasons, he was a genuinely unsettling one. The way he watched Lois, the calm specificity of his plans, the fact that he seemed to understand the full weight of what he intended. It was played for laughs, but the laughs had an undercurrent. After the show's revival, those edges were progressively sanded down. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter from Season 6 was the last major attempt to fully deploy the original character mythology. In those two episodes, Stewie achieves his stated goal. He apparently kills Lois, takes over the world, becomes the global dictator he always described wanting to be. And then the whole thing is revealed to be a simulation, a story that Stewie ran on his computer to see how events would unfold. The original timeline is restored. Lois is fine. The status quo is preserved. The twist was clever in the moment, but it also functioned, consciously or not, as a farewell to the version of Stewie who genuinely might have followed through on his plans. By playing out the entire scenario as a simulation, the show acknowledged what the character had been built toward and then definitively closed the door on it. After those episodes, Stewie's world domination plots became increasingly rare, the attempts on Lois's life mostly stopped, and the character shifted into the more openly emotional, friendship-focused, identity-exploring version of himself that would occupy the remaining seasons. The mythology of evil Stewie left behind several unexplained elements that fans have spent years cataloging and discussing. The precise nature of his intelligence, the source of his technical capabilities, the question of whether he has any true allies or only temporary ones, the full extent of the timeline alterations that the show's various time travel episodes have created, and what those alterations mean for the character's current state. These are not questions with canonical answers. Family Guy doesn't maintain that kind of tight continuity, but they are questions that the show raised, at least implicitly, and never answered. The Time Machine is the richest piece of Stewie's unexplained mythology. It first appears in the Season 1 episode, Mind Over Murder, when Stewie built a prototype to avoid teething pain. That early version was destroyed by Peter stumbling over it, which is either a very funny accident or a deeply frustrating one, depending on how you look at it. Subsequent versions of the machine appeared throughout the show's run, each with slightly different properties and slightly different consequences for the show's continuity. The Big Bang Theory episode from Season 9 revealed, through a time travel paradox, that Stewie is literally responsible for the creation of the universe. His return pad's energy signature matches the cosmic background radiation that produced the Big Bang, meaning the universe created Stewie so he could create the universe. It is the most audacious piece of mythology the show ever attempted for the character, and it has almost no bearing on any other episode before or after it. The accumulation of Stewie's time travel adventures created, over the course of the show, a genuinely complicated and largely untracked alternative timeline history. Brian warned his past self about 9/11 in one episode, creating a world where the attacks were prevented. Stewie traveled back to prevent Brian's death in Christmas Guy. Stewie altered his own conception in Chap Stewie. Freskers. Characters have visited multiple alternative universes, including a Disney universe where everything was drawn in a gentler animation style, and a Robot Chicken universe, a reference to Seth Green's other animated project, where the characters looked like stop-motion figures. All of these excursions have left the show's timeline in a state of cheerful incoherence that the writers seem to find liberating rather than constraining. But there are pieces of Stewie's mythology that seem to have been set up and then quietly forgotten, not resolved, not contradicted, just left sitting in the aired episodes without follow-up. His relationship with Bertram, the rival infant who shared Peter as a biological father and who appeared in multiple Season 8 and Season 9 episodes as a genuine antagonist, essentially disappeared from the show after the Big Bang Theory episode. His connection to a secret society of genius babies, gestured toward in a few early episodes, was never developed. The recurring implication that Stewie's intelligence is somehow known about in certain circles outside the Griffin household, appearing in episodes where government agencies or shadowy organizations appear to be watching him, was raised and dropped multiple times without resolution. These abandoned threads are not failures of the show's writing exactly. Family Guy was never going to maintain the kind of serialized mythology that would allow these threads to be picked up years after they were set down. But they represent a kind of informal lost content. Not episodes that were cut or banned or restricted, but story directions that were started and then abandoned, character elements that were established and then quietly de-established, pieces of a mythology that could have been the backbone of something significantly more substantial than what the show chose to build. Section 6. The 9/11 episode that wasn't. In the weeks following the 11th of September 2001, Virtually every scripted television show in America was scrambling to figure out what to do. Some shows simply went dark for a period. Some rushed to create special episodes that acknowledged the attacks. Some quietly edited existing episodes to remove content that suddenly felt inappropriate or painful. The responses were as varied as the shows themselves, and the decisions made in that period reveal a lot about how different creative teams understood their obligations to their audiences in a moment of national crisis. Family Guy was in a peculiar position during this period. The show had been canceled after its third season in May 2002. By September 2001, the third season was in production but had not yet aired. The show was living on borrowed time, producing episodes for a network that had already decided to move on from it, and the September attacks created an additional layer of uncertainty about content that the team had no real way to navigate cleanly. Several decisions were made in the months following the attacks that affected how existing Family Guy episodes were broadcast or distributed. The World Trade Center backgrounds in A Picture's Worth 1,000 Words and Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows were edited out of rerun versions. The airport security scene from Road to Rhode Island was cut. These were relatively quiet editorial decisions, not announcements, just changes that most viewers would have noticed only if they were comparing old recordings to new broadcasts. But there was a scene from an episode in production during that period, a scene that was ultimately cut from its broadcast version and included on a DVD years later that represents perhaps the most carefully calibrated Family Guy joke about 9/11. This is the scene from Meet the Quagmires, where Brian, during a time travel trip to the 1980s, issues a challenge to a man who has threatened him. Meet me on top of the World Trade Center, the 11th of September 2001, at 8 in the morning. The joke is built on the audience knowing something Brian knows and the challenger doesn't. From Brian's perspective, a character who has traveled from 2007 and knows what happened on that date, the challenge is a darkly clever way of issuing an appointment that his opponent will never be able to keep. The scene did not air in the broadcast version of the episode, which premiered in May 2007. It was released on the DVD. And it was later referenced in the Back to the Pilot episode, creating the situation described earlier where Brian, in an alternate timeline where 9/11 was prevented, shows up at the World Trade Center and finds his challenger very much alive and very much ready to fight. The fact that this joke exists in two forms, a deleted scene that is obscure and a callback in a broadcast episode that is opaque, without knowing the deleted scene, makes it one of the more unusual pieces of Family Guy content from the perspective of completeness. You can understand the callback in Back to the Pilot if you haven't seen the deleted scene. Brian gets beaten up. It's funny on its own terms. But the full joke, the complete arc of the gag that begins in a deleted scene from Season 5 and pays off in a broadcast episode from Season 10, requires access to material that never aired. This is not the only instance of the show's relationship with 9/11 creating content that exists in a split between what aired and what didn't. The Baby Not On Board episode from Season 7 features a scene where the Griffin family visits Ground Zero, which Peter misidentifies as where the first guy got AIDS. Brian corrects him. The scene aired, but other 9/11 references from that era were cut from broadcast and only survived in DVD releases, creating a patchwork of what the show actually said about the event across its full history. MacFarlane himself had a personal connection to September 11th that has been discussed publicly on numerous occasions. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of the 11th of September, 2001, one of the planes that was hijacked and flown into the World Trade Center. He arrived at the airport late, missed the flight, and consequently was not on the plane when it departed. He has spoken about this in various interviews over the years, describing it as a profoundly disorienting experience and acknowledging the enormous luck or misfortune of timing that happened to work in his favor involved in surviving an event that killed nearly 3,000 people. That personal proximity to the events of 9/11 adds a specific texture to the question of how Family Guy engaged with the attacks and their aftermath. MacFarlane's own political and social views, his sense of humor, his willingness to make jokes about things that most people would not joke about, all of these were shaped in ways that are probably impossible to fully articulate by the fact that he very nearly died on a morning that did kill nearly 3,000 other people. The jokes the show made about 9/11, the content that was cut, and the content that aired, existed in the context of a creator who had a relationship to that event that most of the audience didn't know about. This is not to suggest that the jokes were therapy or confession or anything that deliberate. MacFarlane's humor is generally not that kind of humor. But the personal history is there, and it matters as context for understanding why the show's relationship with 9 over 11 references was so complicated, and why the decisions about what to include, what to cut, and what to restore were never entirely straightforward. Section 7. The Death of a Dog, and the episode that shocked the world. Of all the things Family Guy has done across its 5+ years of existence, few have generated as much immediate, sustained, genuine emotional reaction as what happened in Season 12, Episode 6, which aired on the 24th of November, 2013. The episode was called Life of Brian, and in it, Brian Griffin was hit by a car and killed. Let's be clear about what happened and how it happened, because the details matter for understanding why the reaction was as intense as it was. The episode opened with a seemingly normal Family Guy cold open Stewie, frustrated with the risks associated with his time machine, destroyed the device after a close call. This was not played as a major event. It was the kind of thing that gets set up and forgotten. The main plot of the episode involves Stewie and Brian playing street hockey, and in the middle of that ordinary, even mundane scene, a car drove by and struck Brian. Not in a cartoonish, recoverable way. In a way that was shot and written to be understood as fatal. The scene that followed was remarkable for what it was and where it appeared. The Griffin family rushed Brian to a veterinarian. The vet told them that Brian's injuries were too severe to treat. The family gathered around him in the examination room. Brian had a moment to speak to each of them. He told them he loved them. He told Stewie he was grateful for their friendship. And then he died. The episode did not play this for laughs. It was scored as a genuine emotional scene, written with real weight, and for viewers who had grown up watching the show, watching Brian, who had been part of the show since its first episode, who had been a constant presence in a series that prided itself on having no constants, simply die on a veterinary examination table, was genuinely shocking. The family adopted a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos, and the show asked its audience to simply accept this and move on. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Petitions appeared online within hours demanding Brian's return. Social media filled with expressions of grief that ranged from genuine sadness to theatrical outrage. News outlets covered Brian's death as an actual news story. The New York Daily News ran a piece. Entertainment blogs treated it as a major television event. The show had, seemingly without warning, killed one of the most beloved characters in its history. Then, on the 15th of December, 2013, just 3 episodes and roughly 3 weeks after Brian's death, the show aired Christmas Guy. In that episode, Stewie, deeply missing Brian and struggling with his replacement, went to a shopping mall. He encountered a past version of himself who had traveled forward in time for reasons unrelated to Brian's death. He realized that this past version of himself still had a return pad, the device that allows temporal navigation without the full time machine. He stole the pad from his past self, traveled back to the moment before Brian was hit by the car, pushed Brian out of the street, and saved his life. Brian returned. Vinny was gone. Everything reset. MacFarlane waited until after Brian's return to comment publicly. His tweets were characteristic, a somewhat sincere acknowledgement that the whole arc was intended as a reminder to cherish what you have, followed by a more blunt dismissal of the idea that the death had ever been intended as permanent. "I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you?" he wrote. "We'd have to be F-ing high." He also gave a more measured explanation to entertainment reporters. He described the arc as an attempt to prove that the show could still surprise its audience, that nothing was entirely fixed, that after more than a decade on air, the show retained the capacity to do something genuinely unexpected. He acknowledged that the ratings bump was real. The season 12 premiere had been down 21% from the previous year, and the Brian death storyline generated the kind of attention and buzz that the show had not received in some time. He seemed somewhat surprised by the intensity of the anger the death provoked, telling reporters that the creative team had expected a reaction, but not that level of rage. The behind-the-scenes reality of the decision is somewhat more complicated than MacFarlane's public account. There is some evidence that the original plan may have been to keep Brian dead for longer, potentially for most of the season, before eventually bringing him back. Vinny, as voiced by Sariko, was a fully realized character. He had a personality, a specific dynamic with Stewie that was genuinely different from the Brian and Stewie dynamic, and a warmth that some viewers found genuinely charming, despite their frustration at his reason for existing. If the original plan had been to keep Brian dead only temporarily, as MacFarlane suggested, then Vinny was either a very elaborate 3-episode placeholder or the plan changed somewhere in the production process. Danny Trejo, who made a cameo in the episode with the understanding that the situation was temporary, stated publicly that he was told about the plan before the episode aired. Tony Sirico's public statements suggested he understood the temporary nature of the arrangement. But the production of multiple episodes around Vinny, including a full title sequence redesign and story work that was apparently done for episodes that were already in production when the Brian storyline concluded, suggests that at least some planning for a more extended absence had occurred. The Life of Brian episode is also notable for a decision it made about the mechanics of Stewie's time machine, a decision that seems in retrospect like a clear setup for the events of Christmas Guy, but that read differently in the moment. At the opening of Life of Brian, Stewie destroyed his time machine specifically to avoid the risks of continued time travel. The show made a point of establishing that this specific technology was no longer available. Then, in Christmas Guy, the episode that brought Brian back, Stewie used a time travel device to undo Brian's death. The resolution to Brian's death directly depended on the thing that had been established as unavailable at the beginning of the episode that caused it. This is either a clever structural irony, the thing that made Brian's death possible is directly related to the thing that undid it, or it's a retroactive justification, the writers finding the solution they needed in an element that was set up for different reasons. It functions either way. But the precision of the setup suggests that Christmas Guy was planned before Life of Brian aired, that the creative team knew how the arc would resolve, even as they were presenting the death to the audience as potentially permanent. The whole episode, both episodes, really remains one of the most discussed events in Family Guy's history, precisely because the layers of interpretation are so genuinely unsettled. Was it a sincere creative experiment that got pulled back earlier than intended due to audience response? Was it always going to be a 3-episode stunt? Was Vinny meant to be something more? And was he sacrificed to restore a character the network was not willing to permanently remove from the show? The answers to these questions exist somewhere in the internal communications of the production company and the network, and none of them have been made public. What has been made public is MacFarlane's subsequent comment that the show was surprised by how much people still cared. That surprised quality is, in its way, the most interesting thing about the whole episode. Family Guy had spent years making its characters less sympathetic, less consistent, less emotionally available. Brian himself had spent years becoming the pretentious, hypocritical, often genuinely cruel version of himself that the Quagmire confrontation speech had so memorably cataloged. The show had, by its own creative choices, done significant work to make the audience less invested in these characters. And then, when it killed one of them, the audience responded as if all of that diminishment had never happened, as if the Brian they were grieving was the Brian of seasons 1 through 4, the voice of reason and loyal friend, rather than the Brian of seasons 9 through 12, who had become one of the most disliked characters on the show. That gap between the character as he existed in those later seasons and the character as the audience remembered him from the beginning is one of the more interesting psychological phenomena in Family Guy's history. People were not grieving the Brian who appeared in Life of Brian. They were grieving the Brian who used to read books in the living room and make dry observations about Peter's stupidity, the Brian who was genuinely a voice of reason in a house that needed one. The death of a character can activate a kind of retroactive love for a version of the character that no longer existed, and that is exactly what happened here. Section 8. The Anatomy of a Deleted Scene. The deleted scenes of Family Guy occupy a specific and interesting position in the show's larger history. For most of the show's run, deleted scenes were a feature of the DVD release's bonus content that expanded episodes beyond their broadcast versions. Sometimes adding jokes that were too long or too extreme for the broadcast cut, sometimes restoring content that had been edited for time, sometimes including fully animated sequences that were cut entirely for reasons that ranged from pacing concerns to network sensitivity. The deleted content from the first 3 seasons is its own category, as mentioned earlier, largely inaccessible, known to exist but not to be distributed. But the deleted material from the revival era and beyond is extensive and varied, and examining some of it in detail reveals a lot about the gap between what the show thought it could do and what it was actually allowed to do. The Season 2 episode Road to Rhode Island contained a deleted scene of a particular kind. In the broadcast version, Peter and Lois are using couples therapy videos. The videos include an apparently attractive therapist named Dr. Amanda Rebecca. The scene cuts away at a suggestive moment. On the DVD, the scene continues slightly further, adding some additional risque dialogue. But beyond that, there was a rumor persistent enough to have been tracked and discussed in Family Guy research communities that the production studio created an X-rated version of the scene as an internal joke, a fully explicit cut that was never intended for distribution, but that somehow found its way onto the internet. Whether this version genuinely exists or whether it is internet mythology is difficult to verify. What is documented is that this rumor has circulated for long enough and with enough specificity that it became part of the show's unofficial fan mythology. One of those stories that gets repeated and embellished over time until it is impossible to separate what is documented from what is apocryphal. The Season 4 episode Peter's Got Woods, about Peter's friendship with the actor James Woods, contained a deleted scene featuring what appeared to be a parody of an infamous real-world incident involving a celebrity holding a child over a hotel balcony. The scene was cut from broadcast. It appeared on a DVD bonus feature titled Family Guy, Off the Cutting Room Floor. No explanation was ever offered publicly for why this particular visual was cut, while the broadcast version of the episode included other content that was at least as provocative. The asymmetry of these decisions, what gets cut and what doesn't, is one of the show's persistent mysteries, particularly from the perspective of fans who have watched both broadcast and DVD versions and cannot always identify what logic is being applied. The Season 8 episode Brian's Got a Brand New Bag was broadcast with a scene involving Brian and an older woman played by guest star Niecy Nash. The DVD version of the episode contained additional scenes that extended the storyline further, including material that was edited out of the broadcast cut in ways that changed the episode's pacing and some of its character implications. The DVD content is not more explicit in a sexual sense, it is simply more extensive, adding scenes that develop the story in directions the broadcast version left unexplored. This pattern broadcast versions that are edited for time or content, DVD versions that restore or add material is so consistent across the show's history that it creates what is effectively a dual version library. If you have only watched Family Guy on television or through Hulu, you have watched a version of the show that is systematically shorter and in some cases differently concluded from the version that exists on DVD. The differences are not always dramatic, but they accumulate, and they represent a kind of distributed lost media content that was made that exists in physical release, but that is absent from the digital streaming versions that most people access the show through today. This matters particularly for Family Guy because the show's humor often depends on duration. A joke that plays out for 30 seconds might be funny. A joke that plays out for 90 seconds might be tedious. A joke that plays out for 3 minutes in a deleted scene might be something else entirely. The comedy that comes from pure excess, from taking a bit past the point of comfort and into the strange territory beyond it. The DVD releases of Family Guy occasionally contain material that falls into this third category. Scenes that were cut from broadcast not because they were offensive, but because they were too long or too strange, or too committed to a particular kind of absurdism that the writers knew would test the patience of a broadcast audience. One category of deleted material that deserves specific attention is the animatics' rough animated versions of scenes that were cut before the full animation process was completed. Animatics are cheaper than finished animation, produced at an early stage of the production pipeline before the final visual quality is achieved. They exist for most episodes, representing scenes that were written and storyboarded and partially animated before being removed from the episode. Some of these have been included on DVD releases as bonus features. Many have not. The animatics for the first 3 seasons, like the fully completed deleted scenes for those seasons, are largely unavailable to the public. The Lost Media Wiki's entry on the seasons 1 through 3 deleted scenes notes that only 3 scenes from the first season have been publicly surfaced. 2 appearing in old promotional materials and 1 in a behind-the-scenes feature. Given the scale of a typical animated series production, multiple episodes per season, each episode going through multiple drafts and revisions with material cut at every stage, 3 recoverable scenes. From a 3-season run represents a very small fraction of what was likely produced, where the rest of it is. Whether it survived the show's cancellations and subsequent revivals in the archives at Fox or in the personal files of the people who made it remains unknown. Section 9. The Conway-Twitty Files. There is a very specific kind of comedy that operates entirely by refusing to be funny. It is not comedy that fails, it is comedy that succeeds precisely through its own apparent failure. Comedy that looks, from the outside, like someone simply not doing the work, but that is in fact doing a very specific kind of work that requires considerable commitment. It is the comedy of the straight-faced anti-joke, the gag that bets everything on the audience's confusion and then wins by staying the course. Family Guy attempted this kind of comedy with Conway-Twitty, and the results are still being debated. Conway-Twitty was born Harold Lloyd Jenkins in 1933 in Mississippi. He died in 1993 at the age of 59. In his lifetime, he recorded 55 number-one country singles, a record that stood until George Strait surpassed it in 2006. His biggest hit, Hello Darlin', with its spoken introduction, is one of the most immediately recognizable opening lines in the history of country music. He was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. He was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most successful country performers of the 20th century. He was also, by Seth MacFarlane's personal assessment, what MacFarlane described on a 2009 episode of Kevin Pollak's Chat Show as the most astonishingly uncharismatic performer in the history of the business. This is the stated logic behind the Conway-Twitty gag, which first appeared in the extended cut of the direct-to-DVD special Family Guy, Live in Vegas, and then recurred multiple times across several seasons of the main series. The structure of the gag was consistent. A character needed a distraction. The show cut to a real archival performance footage clip of Conway-Twitty performing one of his songs. The clip played in full without interruption for as long as the song lasted, and then the episode resumed as if nothing had happened. There was no punchline, there was no twist, there was no joke at Twitty's expense beyond the implicit claim that watching him perform was so boring that it functioned as a kind of punishment or time filler. The gag was the absence of a gag. MacFarlane's explanation that the humor came from wasting the time of both advertisers and viewers with footage that had nothing to do with the show is the cleanest articulation of what the bit was attempting. Pure anti-comedy. Comedy that works by refusing to work. The first appearance of the gag in Peter's Daughter, where Peter, looking for a distraction when Meg is abandoned at the altar during her wedding, introduces, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Conway-Twitty," and the clip rolls was genuinely surprising. It was unexpected enough that the surprise itself generated a reaction. The second appearance in The Juice is Loose, where the same structure was deployed again and the clip ran for an extended period, began to reveal that the bit was intended to repeat, and the repetition changed its quality. For viewers who found the original gag funny, the repetition was funnier, the show doubling down on the commitment, refusing to be embarrassed by the bit's obvious uselessness, using it again and again as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For viewers who found the original gag tedious, the repetition was worse, not funny in a new way, just more of something that was not funny to begin with, a creative decision that appeared to confuse persistence with quality. MacFarlane's stated intention about wasting advertisers' money raises an interesting question about the economics of broadcast television that most viewers probably never think about. Commercials during Family Guy's Sunday night slot cost real money. Advertisers were paying significant sums to have their spots air during the show. When the show used its runtime to air archival footage of a country singer performing a full song, those advertisers were paying for airtime that was being, by design, actively unenjoyable to watch. Whether this constitutes genuine commentary on the advertising economy, a very expensive inside joke, or simply laziness dressed up in post hoc justification depends on how generously you are inclined to read the decision. The gag eventually attracted the attention of at least one supernatural authority. In the season 12 episode 3 Acts of God, God himself tells Peter that Conway-Twitty has asked for the recurring gag to stop. Even within the universe of the show, Twitty was registering a complaint from beyond the grave. This meta-acknowledgement, the show recognizing, via a character's personal request, that the bit had run its course appeared to mark the end of the gag's active use, though references to it continued in later seasons. The Conway-Twitty gag's relationship to the larger history of Family Guy's creative choices is more substantive than it might first appear. It represents one extreme of the show's approach to the cutaway format, not a cutaway to a short, punchy joke, but a deliberate deployment of footage that makes no comedic claim and simply occupies time. At the other extreme, the show's best cutaways are precise, tightly constructed, and built on specific references that reward attentive viewers. Between those poles lies the entire spectrum of what the cutaway format became over the show's run. Sometimes brilliant, sometimes lazy, sometimes deliberately anti-comedic, and always the thing the show was most famous for doing. Somewhere in Fox's archives, there are hours of Conway-Twitty footage that was licensed for use in Family Guy but never actually deployed. The gag ran for several episodes and then stopped. The additional footage that was presumably acquired for future use sits in a rights library somewhere, ready to air in a context that may never come. That is a specific and unusual kind of lost media, not content that was made and cut, but content that was acquired and never used, waiting in the rights archives of a network for a gag that was retired before it could be deployed again. The metadata around what was licensed, what aired, and what was paid for but never used is genuinely interesting from the perspective of the show's production history. And it opens up a question that applies to the cutaway format more broadly. How much material was produced, animated, or acquired for Family Guy episodes over the years that simply didn't make it into the final cuts? The show's production process generated substantial amounts of content at every stage: writing, animatics, completed animation, archival clip research, and licensing. Only a fraction of what was produced actually aired. The rest is scattered across hard drives, rights libraries, DVD bonus features, and the memories of the people who worked on the show. Section 10. The Meg episode and the secrets of the Griffin basement. There is a specific episode of Family Guy from Season 10 called Seahorse Seashell Party that functions less as a comedy episode and more as a kind of accidental document of everything wrong with the show's treatment of one of its central characters. It is not a lost episode. It is not banned or restricted. It aired in its entirety and is available to watch. But it contains in its final 10 minutes a resolution so genuinely troubling that it might as well be classified as something the show's creative team wishes could be quietly walked back. But before we get to that episode, and to the question of what the show did and did not choose to reveal about Meg Griffin over the course of its run, there are actual pieces of unaired and restricted Meg content that belong in this conversation. The show produced, across its various runs, a number of episodes that dealt with Meg's character in ways that went significantly further than what ultimately aired. Some of these scenes exist in the deleted content on DVDs. Others have been described in interviews or commentary tracks but have not been publicly released. And some represent decisions that were made at the writing stage, stories that were developed, and then abandoned before reaching the animation stage that would have given the character a fundamentally different trajectory if they had been made. There was a version of a late-season episode, discussed in general terms in commentary tracks and fan discussion forums based on that commentary, that would have given Meg a complete arc of self-discovery and independence, an episode in which she genuinely left the Griffin household, found her own community, and experienced what her life could look like without her family's constant diminishment. This version was either written and then not produced, or produced at an early stage and then significantly revised, in ways that are not entirely documented. What exists in public record is that this more hopeful trajectory was under consideration and that it was not ultimately pursued. The closest the show came to actually following through on this potential was in the episode Seahorse Seashell Party, and the way it resolved that episode's central conflict tells you exactly where the creative priorities landed. In that episode, Meg finally articulated, in a sustained emotional speech, exactly what her family had done to her. She named specific behaviors. She connected them to real damage. She was devastating, precise, and, by any reasonable standard, completely correct. The family fell apart in response. Without Meg serving as the target for their frustrations, Peter, Lois, Chris, and Brian turned on each other. The episode showed explicitly that the family dynamic depended on having someone to mistreat, and that without Meg in that role, the structure collapsed. And then Meg took it all back. She went to Brian, the character who in this episode served as the voice of a kind of bleak pragmatism, and she accepted that her role in the family was what it was. She agreed to go back to being the absorber of the household's displaced frustrations, because the alternative, the family being honest with each other about their actual grievances, was apparently worse than the status quo. The episode was written by Mark Henteman, one of the show's more thoughtful writers, and there is an argument to be made that it was intended as a dark satirical commentary on abuse dynamics, a deliberately uncomfortable portrayal of how abuse perpetuates itself. But that reading requires accepting that a show that had spent seasons playing Meg's mistreatment for pure laughs was, in this episode, suddenly making a sophisticated point about the psychology of victimhood. The two interpretations are difficult to hold simultaneously, and many viewers simply receive the episode as the show endorsing the idea that Meg should accept her mistreatment because it serves the family's stability. The episode was widely ranked among the most disliked in the series' history, not because it was poorly made, but because of its moral implications. And the fact that the episodes immediately following it returned to business as usual, Peter insulting Meg, the family piling on, the seahorse moment treated as if it had never happened, suggested that the show had not intended Seahorse Seashell Party as a turning point, but simply as an episode, after which the normal dynamics resumed. What was not known to most viewers was that the season 14 episode Peter's Sister, which finally tried to explain why Peter treated Meg the way he did, revealing that his own sister had abused him growing up, creating a cycle that he was perpetuating with his daughter, had gone through multiple drafts that went further in Peter's reckoning with his behavior. These earlier drafts, referenced in production commentary, contained more explicit scenes of Peter genuinely confronting what he had done to Meg over the years. The version that aired was already more emotionally direct than most Family Guy episodes managed. The versions that were written but not made were apparently more direct still. The decision to pull back to have Peter acknowledge his behavior but not change it, to have the father-daughter reconciliation in Peter's Sister reset by the next episode as if it had never happened, reflects a creative philosophy that prioritized the status quo over genuine character development. The show had an opportunity at multiple points to let Meg's story arc go somewhere. The drafts and deleted scenes and unproduced story ideas represent the ghost of a different version of the show, one that would have given this specific character something other than a decade of sustained humiliation, followed by a resolution that essentially endorsed her victimhood. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg since season 2, has spoken about the character in ways that suggest a kind of affectionate resignation to the role's specific indignities. She has mentioned that people would say the dismissive catchphrase associated with Meg's abuse to her in public, at events, on the street after the show had made it famous. That the fictional cruelty toward a cartoon character had found its way into how real people interacted with the real woman who gave that character her voice is one of the stranger collisions between Family Guy's content and its real-world effects. The fully unaired material around Meg's character, the scenes that were cut, the storylines that were written and not produced, the more fully realized versions of episodes that aired in compromised form, represents a body of content that has never been systematically cataloged or made public. It exists in the memories of writers and producers, in the files of the production company, possibly in old drafts that may or may not have been preserved. It is lost in the way that most creative process is lost, not accidentally deleted or stolen or locked in a vault, but simply never made available because the show moved on and the people who made it moved on, leaving behind only the versions that were approved and broadcast. Section 11. Hidden continuity and the threads that never tied. One of the more intellectually interesting aspects of Family Guy's history is the degree to which it contains continuity that it is technically not supposed to have. The show's creative identity, particularly after the revival, was built in part on an explicit rejection of continuity. Episodes reset to the status quo. Events from one episode did not carry over to the next. Characters who died came back. Significant decisions were undone. The show operated on the principle that nothing was permanent and consistency was optional. And yet, if you watch closely enough across a sufficient number of episodes, patterns emerge. References accumulate. Details established in one episode quietly reappear in another. Relationships and histories that are never explicitly acknowledged in any single episode form, when viewed as a whole, something that resembles a coherent background mythology, not a tight, serialized narrative, but a set of recurring elements that, collectively, suggest something more intentional than pure randomness. The question is whether this apparent continuity is the product of deliberate tracking or simply the inevitable result of a large writing staff working on the same show for decades with enough shared knowledge of the show's history that certain details naturally recur without any central organizing decision. The Griffin family history is the clearest example of this. Over the course of the show's run, substantial amounts of information have been revealed about Peter and Lois's backgrounds, their relationship history, their families, and the events that shaped who they are. Some of this information is internally inconsistent. Peter's backstory has been contradicted multiple times, with the show offering multiple different explanations for his origins and family history. But some of it accumulates into something recognizable: the town where Peter grew up, the specific dynamics of his family, the reasons why Peter and Lois ended up together, which have been explained in multiple flashback episodes across different seasons. The Pewterschmidt family history on Lois's side is particularly well developed across multiple episodes. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt's business empire, his complicated relationship with Peter, the dynamics between Lois and her siblings, the family's old money New England culture, these elements recur consistently enough to suggest deliberate tracking, even in a show that nominally doesn't track anything. More interesting, from the perspective of lost and hidden content, are the episodes that set up elements that were never paid off. The early seasons contained a handful of moments that appeared to be setups for future storylines, references to things about the characters' histories that seemed to be positioned as reveals waiting to happen, details that were introduced with an apparent weight that suggested they would be returned to. The most frequently discussed example is a moment from an early season episode where Stewie appeared to recognize something or someone in a way that suggested knowledge of his own future or a history beyond what had been established. These moments, deliberately ambiguous, possibly the result of the writers planting seeds they intended to grow, mostly went without harvest. The stories they seemed to be setting up were never told, either because the creative team lost interest, or because the character's direction changed after the revival, or because what looked like setup was simply an artifact of how the early writers were constructing individual scenes without a larger plan. The giant chicken storyline is one of the show's most discussed examples of accidental continuity. The first fight between Peter and Ernie the giant chicken, triggered by Ernie giving Peter a supposedly expired coupon, appeared in the third season episode Da Boom. It was bizarre, extended, and extremely violent, operating in the show's visual language as a self-contained parody of action movie fight choreography. It was also a one-off, but the chicken came back, and came back again. And each return deepened the apparent mythology of the feud. The chicken had a wife, a life, a context that extended beyond his role as Peter's inexplicable nemesis. Later episodes revealed details of the chicken's personal life, including his marriage to a woman who appeared alongside him during their fight and seemed invested in the outcome in ways that suggested the feud was disrupting actual human relationships. There was never a definitive explanation for why the first fight happened the way it did. The expired coupon is the stated reason, but the violence of Peter's response, and the chicken's equally disproportionate response, suggests something more fundamental: a rivalry, or a recognition, or a history that predates the coupon. Fan communities have constructed elaborate theories about what the true nature of the Ernie the Giant Chicken relationship might be. Some of these theories are clearly joking. Some are more serious attempts to find a narrative logic that explains why two characters are willing to destroy significant portions of a city over what is nominally a coupon dispute. The show has never clarified. The fights continued through many seasons, each one escalating in scale and destructiveness, and the question of why they happen, what the chicken actually is, what he represents, whether there is a real history between him and Peter, remains as open as it was in the show's third season. This open-endedness is, in its way, one of the more interesting choices the show made about its own mythology. By never explaining the chicken, by continuing the fights without resolution, the show preserved a genuine mystery in what was otherwise a property that aggressively domesticated its own strangeness over the years. The chicken fights work partly because they are unexplained, the violence is funnier for being unmotivated, the scale is more absurd for having no context. An explanation would resolve the mystery and almost certainly diminish it. There are dozens of smaller continuity threads running through Family Guy's history that have a similar quality established but unresolved, potentially meaningful or potentially meaningless, present enough to notice but absent enough that their absence becomes a feature rather than a flaw. The show's many apparently abandoned storylines around recurring characters, the various hints at Stewie's larger role in cosmic events, the unresolved backstory elements for Joe Swanson, whose history as a police officer before his disability was referenced multiple times without ever being fully explored. All of this hidden and unexplained continuity represents a kind of distributed mystery, not lost media in the traditional sense of content that was made and then removed from access, but story in the sense of narrative potential that was created and then never fully realized. Scattered through the show's 2-5-year run like seeds that were planted but never watered. Section 12. The future of the mystery and what remains unknown. We are reaching the end of what is, by any measure, an enormous accumulation of history. 3 decades of production, more than 400 episodes, multiple cancellations, multiple revivals, dozens of controversies, hundreds of creative decisions that ranged from brilliant to disastrous, and a body of lost, restricted, and mysterious content that continues to grow as the show continues, and as the research community continues to investigate what already exists. The story of Family Guy's mysteries does not have a clean conclusion, which is appropriate given that the show itself is still being made. In April 2025, the show was renewed through season 27, taking it to the 2028 to 2029 television season and its 30th anniversary. Each new season produces new episodes, and each new episode has the potential to create new controversies, new censorship decisions, new pieces of content that end up cut or restricted or pulled from circulation for reasons that won't be fully understood for years. But the history that already exists, the history we have moved through over the past several hours, has a few areas where the mysteries feel genuinely unresolved and where future discoveries remain plausible. The first 3 seasons' deleted scenes continue to be the single largest body of genuinely lost Family Guy material. The Lost Media Wiki community has documented what exists and what is missing, and the case for future discoveries is strong. Animation studios generate enormous amounts of material in the production process, and the people who worked on those early seasons are still alive and in many cases still working in animation. There may well be animators and writers who have copies of material from that era on old hard drives or in physical archives that they have not thought to make public. The discovery of the full pilot on Robert Paulson's portfolio website suggests that this kind of rediscovery is entirely possible. It requires only someone thinking to look in the right place or the right person deciding to make available something they have been sitting on without realizing its significance. The early drafts of episodes, particularly the early draft of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and whatever other scripts may have been significantly revised before reaching production, represent another category of potentially discoverable material. Scripts are text documents. They survive in ways that video files sometimes don't, and the animation industry has a rich community of collectors and archivists who seek out exactly this kind of material. The partial script that was surfaced on social media in 2020 and then lost suggests that the full early draft of the episode exists somewhere, held by someone who may not have fully appreciated what they had or may have been unwilling to make it publicly available. The uncensored versions of episodes from season 18 onward represent a more systemic gap. According to the censorship documentation that fans have compiled, fully uncensored versions of episodes from season 18 onward have never been released, not on DVD, not through any streaming service, not through any public channel. The DVD releases that included uncensored content for earlier seasons did not continue for the later seasons. This means that there is a large body of Family Guy content that may exist in an uncensored form somewhere in the production company's archives, but that has never been made available to the public. Whether those versions exist in a state that could be released, and whether the rights environment would permit their release, is uncertain. But their potential existence represents a meaningful category of inaccessible content. The question of what MacFarlane himself has retained from the show's production is worth considering. He has been the voice of multiple characters since the show began, recording lines for every season across 25 years. He has been present, to varying degrees, in the creative process throughout that time. What he has archived recordings, scripts, correspondence, production materials is almost entirely unknown. There are interview clips and public comments scattered across decades of press coverage, but the private archive of the show's creator, whatever it contains, is not publicly accessible. There is also the matter of the Fox corporate archives. Fox, now owned by the Walt Disney Company, maintains archives of its programming that are not publicly accessible. What those archives contain in terms of Family Guy material, unaired content, production documents, censorship correspondence, the internal communications about decisions like the partial terms of endearment broadcast ban is genuinely unknown. Corporate archives are not typically released to the public, and there is no particular reason to expect that Family Guy's archives would be an exception. But they exist, and they almost certainly contain answers to questions that the public research community has been unable to resolve. Partial terms of endearment remains the most significant single item of restricted Family Guy content. 20 years after it was banned from American broadcast, it still has not aired on American television. It is available on the Season 8 DVD, it aired in the UK, and it has been discussed extensively in the media and in the fan community. But its permanent absence from the show's streaming presence in the United States Hulu carries the complete show except for this episode, and has done so consistently makes it a specific and ongoing case of content restriction that has outlasted the immediate context that motivated it. The abortion debate that made the episode too sensitive to broadcast in 2010 has not become less sensitive in the intervening years. There is no particular reason to expect that this will change. The history of lost and restricted Family Guy content is also, inevitably, a history of the show's relationship with the culture it inhabited. The episodes that were banned or restricted were banned or restricted because they touched subjects that the culture around them found difficult to process at specific moments in time. The 9/11 edits reflect a moment of national trauma and the broadcasting decisions made in its immediate aftermath. The Turban Cowboy situation reflects both the horror of the Boston Marathon bombing and the specific virality of misinformation in the social media era. The partial terms of endearment ban reflects the enduring sensitivity around reproductive rights in American politics. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein delay reflects the early 2000s uncertainty about how jokes about Jewish stereotypes would be received. None of these decisions were made in isolation from their cultural moment, and understanding them requires understanding the moments that produce them. The show's lost content is not just a story about animation and censorship. It is a story about American culture across 25 years, told through the specific lens of what one animated comedy was and was not allowed to say and when. The pilot, found in March 2025, sitting for 27 years on the website of an animator who worked on it, waiting for someone patient enough to look, is the most optimistic note in this entire history. It suggests that the lost content of Family Guy is not permanently lost, that the research community's patience and creativity can recover things that have disappeared from public view, and that the history of the show is still being written even as the show itself continues to produce new episodes. There are things we don't know. There are things we may eventually find out. There are things that are probably gone for good. The mystery of Family Guy, the gap between what was made and what was shown, between what was intended and what was actually produced, between the show that was imagined and the show that exists, is a mystery that will probably outlast the show itself. And that, in its way, is exactly right. The most interesting things about any creative work are not the things that were fully realized and perfectly presented. They are the edges and the absences and the what-ifs, the material that almost existed, the decisions that could have gone differently, the stories that were built toward and then abandoned. Family Guy's lost content is not a failure. It is a record of 30 years of creative ambition, commercial compromise, cultural collision, and the endless, irreducible difficulty of making something that lasts. The show that premiered after Super Bowl 33 in 1999, with Stewie already fully formed as the villain he was always going to be, and Brian already dry and witty in exactly the way he was always going to be, and Peter already stumbling through a world that accommodated his chaos with patient resignation. That show contained within it, already, the seeds of everything that would follow. The cancellations, the revival, the creative drift, the controversies, the banned episodes, the lost pilot, the death and resurrection of a beloved character, the slow accumulation of mystery over 3 decades. All of that was in there, somehow, in that first 6-minute pitch, made for $50,000, and the hope that someone at Fox would see in it what McFarlane saw. They did, and it's been complicated ever since. Section 13. The giant chicken, the recurring gag with no origin, and the lore that built itself. There is a specific kind of joke in Family Guy that operates differently from every other kind of joke the show makes. Most Family Guy humor announces itself, the setup is clear, the cutaway is flagged, the punchline arrives with the kind of structural obviousness that lets you know you are watching a joke being told. But the giant chicken fights are something else. They arrive without setup. They escalate without apology. They end without resolution. And they keep coming back. The first fight between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken appeared in the Season 3 episode Da Boom, which first aired in December 1999 and dealt with Peter's post-Y2K apocalypse fantasies. Ernie appeared as a giant humanoid rooster in a suit, handing out coupons outside a local restaurant. He gave Peter a coupon. Peter attempted to use it. The coupon, Ernie informed him, had expired. And then, without ceremony or justification, Peter and Ernie began fighting. The fight lasted several minutes of screen time. It destroyed significant portions of Quahog's urban infrastructure. It moved through multiple environments, escalating from the street to the interior of buildings to the rooftops of the town, each exchange more physically impossible than the last. The show shot it with a genuine cinematic seriousness that was entirely at odds with the fact that it was a cartoon man fighting a giant chicken over an expired coupon. There was no punchline. The fight simply ended when one of them prevailed, and the episode moved on as if nothing unusual had happened. Ernie came back, and the fights kept escalating. By the time you reach the Season 4 fight in Blind Ambition, or the Season 8 fight in Internal Affairs, or the Season 10 fight in Back to the Pilot, the giant chicken confrontations had become one of the most elaborately developed running gags in the show's history, not because anyone ever explained what they meant, but because the show kept adding details to Ernie's life that made the conflict feel impossibly like it had actual stakes. He had a wife. Her name was Nicole. She appeared in later fights, watching the battle with a specific personal investment that implied the feud was disrupting real domestic arrangements. He had friends. He had a job. He was, within the logic of the show's universe, a full person with a life outside the context of his periodic savage battles with a middle-aged man from Quahog. The question of why the first fight happened, what was actually going on between Peter and Ernie beneath the expired coupon surface explanation, has never been answered within the show's canon. Fan theories have proliferated over the years in ways that are genuinely inventive. Some argue that the giant chicken is a manifestation of Peter's repressed aggression, a physical form given to the frustrations of a man who is too underdeveloped to process conflict through language or reason. Some argue the two of them have a prehistory that the show deliberately withholds, that they have met before in some context the audience never sees, and that the explosive violence of their encounters reflects unresolved grievances from that hidden past. Some argue, more simply, that the expired coupon is genuinely sufficient, that the comedy works precisely because the show refuses to explain that it is possible to be this committed to a fight over something this small. What is documentable is that the giant chicken fights changed over time in ways that went beyond simple escalation. The later fights contained real stakes for Ernie in a way the early fights did not. The Season 10 fight in Internal Affairs, which took place partly in and around Ernie's home and involved Nicole in a specific and personal way, was shot with a quality of genuine consequence, not just property damage and cartoon physics. but the suggestion that these recurring encounters had accumulated meaning for Ernie in ways that were separate from whatever meaning they held for Peter. Ernie was not simply a punching bag or a recurring prop. He was a character with a life the audience was only occasionally allowed to see. The lost content dimension of the Giant Chicken story is not a matter of banned episodes or cutscenes. There is no evidence of giant chicken fight footage that was pulled from any episode. The mystery is more conceptual. What, in the minds of the writers who kept returning to this storyline, was the giant chicken actually doing in the show's universe? Was there ever a plan for a final confrontation that would resolve the feud? Was there a backstory that was developed in the writer's room and simply never committed to screen? Did MacFarlane, who voiced multiple characters and supervised the show's creative direction through its early seasons, have a specific understanding of who Ernie was that he chose not to share with the audience? The answers to these questions are not available in any public record. The DVD commentaries for the episodes containing giant chicken fights are generally playful about the gag without being revelatory. The writers and producers who discuss the fights in those commentaries tend to celebrate the absurdism without illuminating its origins. What survives is the gag itself, running across multiple seasons and dozens of minutes of screen time, accumulating detail without acquiring explanation, developing mythology without providing meaning. That combination, rich detail without explanation, mythology without meaning, is characteristic of the show's most interesting recurring elements. The giant chicken fights are not the only example of Family Guy building something elaborate around a concept it refuses to elucidate, but they are the clearest example of the show creating the feeling of deep lore from material that may have no depth beneath its surface at all. Whether Ernie the Giant Chicken means something is a question the show has been refusing to answer for 25 years. That refusal is, in its way, the most interesting thing about him. Section 14. The voice actors, the casting decisions, and the near misses that would have changed everything. The cast of Family Guy is so thoroughly associated with the characters they play that it takes a specific effort of imagination to consider that the show could have sounded completely different if any number of early casting decisions had gone the other way. The voices are not incidental to the characters in an animated series, where the physical performance is replaced entirely by vocal performance. The specific qualities of a voice actor's instrument and sensibility are as character-defining as anything in the script. Mila Kunis is Meg in a way that shapes how the character sounds and therefore how she is received. Seth Green is Chris in a way that makes the character's specific brand of confused adolescence possible. Alex Borstein is Lois in a way that gives the character her emotional range. Remove any of those specific voices and replace them with different ones, and you have a different show. The earliest casting uncertainty involved Lois Griffin. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois since the show's beginning, has recounted that she was brought in to voice the pilot while still working on Mad TV, and that the audition was essentially sight unseen. She had not met MacFarlane, had not seen his artwork, and was asked to provide a voice for a character she knew almost nothing about. She developed the voice from a specific source, a red-headed mother she was portraying in a stage show she was doing at the time. That accidental alignment between her theatrical work and the character she was being asked to voice created something specific that the show apparently couldn't replicate with other performers. Meg Griffin's casting history is more complicated and contains an actual on-screen transition that viewers of the show's first 2 seasons can observe directly. In Season 1, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert, who was working simultaneously on Party of Five as a regular cast member. Chabert left after Season 1 due to time conflicts with her television commitments and her schoolwork. She was still a teenager at the time, and the demands of multiple major commitments were simply more than the schedule could accommodate. Mila Kunis auditioned for the replacement role, and MacFarlane reportedly called her back with a specific note: slow down. Kunis had read quickly in her first audition, and MacFarlane wanted a more deliberate delivery. She adjusted, and the role was hers. The Chabert to Kunis transition is audible in the early seasons if you are listening for it. Chabert's Meg has a slightly different quality, a bit more conventionally teenage, a bit more immediately sympathetic in the specific way of a performer who was genuinely close to the character's age at the time of recording. Kunis's Meg is a slightly more settled, slightly more resigned version of the character, a quality that would serve the character well as the show's treatment of her became more extreme. Whether either performer would have navigated the show's later seasons the same way is impossible to know, but the specific texture of Kunis's performance, the weary dignity she brings to Meg even when the material is at its cruelest, has been one of the more consistent things about the character across decades of variable writing. Seth Green's casting as Chris involved an audition story that has become something close to Family Guy lore in its own right. Green told reporters that he did an impression of Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs during his audition, a very specific choice for a teenage boy character, drawing on one of the more unsettling voice performances in American cinema. MacFarlane found this exactly right. The specific quality of Green's Chris, the slightly off-center delivery, the sense of a voice that is searching for the note it wants to hit without quite finding it, comes from whatever made that Silence of the Lambs impression the correct reference point. It is not an obvious choice. The fact that it produced one of the show's most consistent and distinctive character voices says something about the kind of creative alchemy that casting depends on. The Pitch pilot's discovery in 2025 made MacFarlane's own voice for Chris available for direct comparison. In The Pitch, MacFarlane voices Chris competently, but generically it reads as a placeholder, a voice that says teenager here without creating a specific person. Green's version creates a specific person, a kid who is not quite connected to the frequencies that the people around him are broadcasting on, who processes the world through a slightly different signal than everyone else. That difference is not just a matter of vocal quality. It is a matter of how a performer understands a character's fundamental relationship to the world, and it changes everything about how the scenes with Chris land. The question of near misses casting decisions that almost went differently, roles that almost went to other performers, is one where reliable information is limited, but speculation has run for years within the show's fan community. MacFarlane himself has been relatively quiet about alternate casting histories. The DVD commentaries occasionally contain oblique references to auditions or early casting discussions without providing the detail that would make those references genuinely illuminating. What is known is that the show's voice cast, in its final assembled form, had a specific chemistry that was neither guaranteed by the script alone nor simply the result of whoever happened to be available. The chemistry between MacFarlane's Brian and MacFarlane's Stewie, two characters voiced by the same person, created a performance dynamic that is technically unusual. Both Brian and Stewie were MacFarlane recording with himself, and the relationship between them in the early seasons benefited from whatever understanding that created. MacFarlane knew what Stewie was going to say before Brian had to react, because he was going to say it himself. That kind of internal knowledge of a scene's full emotional and comedic shape is something that actors working in genuine improvisation or ensemble performance cannot have, and it may have contributed to the specific quality of the early Brian and Stewie exchanges, the sense that both characters were operating from the same understanding of a scene without either having to signal their intentions. There is also the matter of guest voices, and the guests who recorded content for the show that was either cut entirely or significantly edited before broadcast. The show has a long history of high-profile guest appearances, and the gap between guests who were announced or who completed recording sessions and guests who actually appeared in broadcast episodes is larger than it is publicly documented. Some deleted scenes that have surfaced on DVD releases contain guest voice work that was cut from broadcast versions. The full extent of recorded guest content that never made it to air is not publicly known. Section 15. The Road to Episodes. A franchise within a franchise and its missing pieces. The Road to Episodes of Family Guy represent one of the show's most internally consistent bodies of work, a series within the series, built around the specific pairing of Brian and Stewie that maintained a quality level across multiple installments that the main show often struggled to sustain. They began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2, a relatively grounded buddy adventure episode that sent Brian and Stewie across the country trying to get home from a failed trip. That episode established the format and the chemistry, and the show returned to it repeatedly across the following seasons with increasing ambition. Road to Europe in Season 3 expanded the scale and introduced the show's willingness to use the road format for genuine parody and pastiche. The episode contained extended sequences that parodied specific European cultural references and demonstrated that MacFarlane and his writers were willing to let Brian and Stewie carry a full episode in a comedic register that was different from the show's usual approach. Road to Rupert in Season 5 used the format for something smaller and more intimate, a road trip anchored in Stewie's attachment to his stuffed bear rather than any larger plot machinery. Road to Germany in Season 7 sent the pair back in time to 1939 and constructed an actual historical thriller narrative around the comedy, using the Holocaust as a backdrop in ways that were bold enough to generate discussion, and that mostly worked because the episode took the historical context seriously, even while using it for comedy. Road to the Multiverse in Season 8 is the installment most often cited as the high watermark of the entire sub-franchise. The episode sent Brian and Stewie hopping between alternate universes using a remote control device, each universe representing a different animation style, a Disney-style universe, a Robot Chicken-style universe, a Flintstone-style universe, and others, and each providing a fresh comedic context that the show could not have constructed within its normal aesthetic constraints. The Disney Universe sequence, in particular, generated significant attention for the quality of its Disney animation pastiche and for the specific commentary it offered on the differences between Disney's visual language and Family Guy's. What is less known about the Road to franchise is the extent of material that was developed for installments that did not reach their planned form or that was cut from installments that did air. The DVD releases for the Road to episodes are generally among the richer bonus content releases in the show's physical library, suggesting that these episodes generated more material than other episodes and that more of it survived to be included on the discs. But the commentaries for these episodes occasionally reference sequences that were developed or partially produced and then removed from the final cut scenes that would have extended the adventures further, or taken them in directions that were ultimately judged to be too long or tonally inconsistent with the rest of the episode. The planned but unproduced Road to installments are the more interesting category. Fan communities have accumulated, from various interviews and commentary tracks over the years, references to at least 2 or 3 Road to concepts that were discussed seriously in the writer's room at various points and that did not proceed to production. The reasons for non-production are not consistently documented. Sometimes the concept was felt to be too similar to an existing installment. Sometimes the timing wasn't right. Sometimes the logistics of the animation required for a particular vision were too complex given the production schedule. But the fact that the sub-franchise had planned extensions that were set aside means there is a body of conceptual material story outlines, possibly early script drafts that represents a shadow version of where the Road to franchise could have gone. Road to the North Pole in Season 9 and Life of Brian, which contained road-adjacent elements in its structure, suggested that the franchise was willing to evolve into holiday special territory and to engage with genuine emotional weight rather than pure adventure. Road to India in Season 15 and Road to the Pilot in Season 10 demonstrated that the format could sustain both international scope and intensely self-referential meta-commentary. Each installment added something to the accumulated mythology of the Brian and Stewie pairing without ever fully explaining that mythology, what these two characters mean to each other, why they specifically orbit each other when the household contains so many other possible pairings. The lost content within the Road to franchise is not primarily a matter of banned episodes or pulled scenes. It is a matter of the gap between the franchise as it existed and the franchise as it could have been, the installments that were planned and not made, the extensions of the format that were discussed and set aside, the directions that were explored at the conceptual level and then abandoned in favor of the directions that actually reached the screen. Section 16. The Writers' Strike and the Episodes That Fractured. The Writers Guild of America strike of 2007 to 2008 affected virtually every scripted television show in production during that period. The strike began in November 2007 and lasted until February 12, 2008, roughly 3 months, during which thousands of television and film writers refused to work as part of a labor action focused on compensation for DVD sales and digital distribution. Shows that were in production when the strike began suddenly found themselves without scripts. Seasons that had been planned for specific lengths were cut short. Production schedules that had been organized around steady creative output were disrupted in ways that took months to fully recover from. Family Guy was in its 6th season when the strike began, and the disruption was significant in ways that went beyond simple production delay. MacFarlane, who had been a strong advocate for the Writers Guild during earlier labor disputes, was a visible supporter of the strike. He joined picket lines and made his position clear publicly. But Fox, operating as a corporation, had a different relationship to the work stoppage. They had a library of completed episodes that they had the contractual right to broadcast, and they chose to use that right in a way that created significant friction with MacFarlane. During the strike, Fox aired 3 Family Guy episodes that had been completed before the work stoppage began, doing so without MacFarlane's permission or endorsement. The episodes existed, Fox owned the broadcast rights, and Fox broadcast them. Legally, the action was defensible. Creatively and personally, from MacFarlane's perspective, it was a unilateral decision made over his explicit objection, his show being used by his network at a moment when he was publicly and specifically committed to not working. The tension that action created between MacFarlane and Fox persisted in various forms for years afterward, contributing to the complicated relationship between creator and network that eventually led to his public statements about wanting the show on a different network entirely. The strike disrupted the Season 6 production schedule in ways that affected the quality and coherence of episodes produced in the strike's immediate aftermath. When the strike ended in February 2008, the writing staff returned to work that had been interrupted, in some cases for months. Story arcs that had been in progress were continued or were reset depending on how far they had developed before the stoppage. The rhythm of a writing room, the accumulated context, and shared understanding of where a season is going that builds over weeks of continuous work had been broken, and rebuilding it took time that the production schedule often didn't fully allow. The episodes that aired in the spring of 2008, as Season 6 concluded and Season 7 began, showed the effects of that disruption in ways that are identifiable in retrospect. The tonal inconsistency that critics of those seasons noted, the sense of episodes that didn't quite connect to each other, of character behavior that varied more than usual from week to week, is at least partly attributable to the disruption of the creative process by the work stoppage. Writing rooms build momentum across a season. The strike broke that momentum at a critical point. The specific episodes that Fox aired without MacFarlane's permission during the strike are documentable, though the public record of which episodes they were specifically is inconsistent across different sources. What is clear is that the act of airing them created a situation where viewers were watching Family Guy content that its creator had not endorsed for broadcast at that particular time, content that existed in finished form but that was released in a context its creator found objectionable. This is a narrow but real category of Family Guy content, episodes that aired under circumstances that MacFarlane specifically did not sanction. The 2023 WGA strike created a comparable disruption for the show's more recent production history. MacFarlane, along with the show's current showrunners Rich Apple and Alex Sulkin, committed to not working on their shows for the duration of the strike. They were visible on picket lines in ways that were consistent with MacFarlane's long-standing labor advocacy. Season 22, which had been in production when the strike began in May 2023, was affected by the work stoppage in ways that altered both its production timeline and, presumably, the specific content of episodes that were in various stages of development when the writers stopped working. The relationship between labor actions and the shape of creative content is one of the more under-examined aspects of long-running television production. The strikes of 2007 to 2008 and 2023 are the most significant examples from Family Guy's history, but there were smaller disruptions across the show's production history that affected specific seasons in ways that are not always publicly documented. The creative output of a writing room is sensitive to disruption in ways that other forms of production are not. A delayed delivery of set materials doesn't change the creative vision for a live-action episode, but a 3-month gap in a writer's room can fundamentally alter the shape of a television season. Section 17. The Simpsons Guy, the crossover, and what it revealed about the show's self-understanding. In September 2014, Family Guy aired what was at the time the longest episode in the show's history. The Simpsons Guy was a crossover between Family Guy and The Simpsons, bringing the Griffin family to Springfield for a full-length adventure that allowed the 2 most prominent animated family sitcoms in American television history to occupy the same animated space for approximately 45 minutes. The episode was a significant production undertaking. It required coordination between two separate production teams, the involvement of both shows' full voice casts, and the construction of a narrative that honored both shows' established tones and histories while creating something genuinely new. The episode has been discussed extensively in terms of its quality, its humor, its specific references and parodies, and its place in both shows' histories. What has received less attention is what The Simpsons Guy revealed about how Family Guy understood its relationship to The Simpsons, and, by extension, how it understood its own place in the history of American animated television. Family Guy launched in 1999, 8 years after The Simpsons had established the template for primetime animated family comedy. MacFarlane has consistently acknowledged The Simpsons as a foundational influence, the show that demonstrated that animated comedy could exist in primetime for adult audiences. That cleared the space in which Family Guy could subsequently exist. But the relationship between the two shows has also been characterized by a specific competitive friction that both shows have occasionally acknowledged directly. The Simpsons, in its middle seasons, made jokes about Family Guy's humor style. Family Guy has made jokes about The Simpsons' decline. The crossover episode was, among other things, an opportunity for both shows to address that friction on screen. The crossover also created a specific category of potentially lost content. The episode's production required voice work and animation decisions that went through two separate creative teams, and the amount of material developed for the episode that didn't reach the final cut was presumably substantial. The runtime of 45 minutes, nearly double a standard Family Guy episode, still required significant editing from what was originally written and storyboarded. The DVD release of The Simpsons Guy contains a limited amount of additional material, but the gap between the episode's development and its final form is one that the available archival record does not fully document. There is also the question of the episode's post-broadcast life. The Simpsons Guy exists in an unusual rights situation, a crossover between two shows with separate ownership structures and separate streaming arrangements. Family Guy streams primarily on Hulu. The Simpsons streams primarily on Disney+. The Simpsons Guy is technically a Family Guy episode and therefore part of the Family Guy library on Hulu, but its full value as a document of the crossover depends on an audience familiar with both shows. The episode's accessibility in the context of streaming fragmentation is a minor but real version of the broader phenomenon of content becoming difficult to experience as intended when its context is distributed across separate platforms. Section 18. The International Dimension, How the Show Played, and What Got Cut Around the World. One of the less examined aspects of Family Guy's content history is the degree to which the show was edited, restricted, or outright unavailable in various international markets across its run. American audiences experiencing the show through broadcast or streaming were experiencing one version of it. International audiences in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Germany, in South Korea, in the numerous other markets where the show aired in various forms were frequently experiencing different versions, shaped by the censorship frameworks and broadcasting regulations of their specific national contexts. The UK experience of Family Guy is the most extensively documented international variation. The BBC's decision to air Partial Terms of Endearment, the episode that has never been broadcast in the United States, is the most prominent example of the UK receiving content that America didn't. But it is far from the only example. The UK broadcast versions of Family Guy episodes frequently included content in slightly different form from American broadcasts, sometimes in ways that made the UK version more permissive, and sometimes in ways that reflected British broadcasting standards' own specific sensitivities. The episode 420, which dealt with marijuana legalization and which generated Venezuelan government backlash that led to the show being banned from Venezuelan cable television, aired in different forms in different international markets. The Venezuelan situation is itself an interesting piece of Family Guy international history. The Season 7 episode 420, which features Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town, prompted the Venezuelan justice minister to cite the episode as an example of American media promoting drug use, and cable stations in Venezuela were warned they would face fines for continuing to air the show. The ban was real and documented, though its duration and current status are less clearly established in public records. It represents one of the more formally governmental responses to Family Guy content outside the United States. Not a network censorship decision, but an actual regulatory action by a national government. Germany's broadcast history with Family Guy includes multiple episodes that aired in altered forms, scenes cut or dialogue modified in response to German broadcast regulations around specific content categories. Australia's broadcast history is similar, with various episodes experiencing cuts or delays related to the Australian Broadcasting Authority's content standards. In each case, the international broadcast version of a Family Guy episode is potentially different from any other version of the same episode, creating a global patchwork of alternate cuts that has never been comprehensively documented. The streaming era has partially simplified this situation. Disney Plus's international library, which includes Family Guy content in markets outside the United States, uses primarily standardized versions of episodes that reduce the variation between markets. But it has also created new international content gaps, particularly around episodes like Partial Terms of Endearment that are absent from American streaming, but have different statuses in international libraries. The Disney Plus Star add-on, available in several international markets, includes some content that is not available on the American version of the service. Turban Cowboy, which was absent from American Hulu for 9 years, was available on the international Star service during part of that period. The international dimension of what is and isn't available where adds a layer of complexity to the overall picture of Family Guy's accessible content history. Section 19. The uncensored versions and the gap after Season 17. The history of Family Guy's DVD releases tells a specific story about how the show's relationship with its own content changed over time. The early season DVD sets were significant events in the show's commercial history. The DVD sales of the first 3 seasons were a major factor in convincing Fox to revive the show, generating income and demonstrating audience loyalty at a moment when the show had no other revenue stream. Those early DVDs were produced with care, including commentary tracks, bonus features, and crucially uncensored versions of episodes that differed from their broadcast counterparts. The uncensored DVD versions of early Family Guy episodes are often substantially different from their broadcast equivalents. Scenes that aired with bleeped dialogue were restored with the actual words. Visual gags that were modified for broadcast, including the famous Deep Throats scene from Season 4 that aired with characters clothed but appeared on the DVD in a more explicit version, were presented in their original form. The gap between broadcast and DVD content was consistently a selling point for the physical releases, giving fans a reason to purchase the discs beyond simple archival ownership. This pattern of uncensored DVD releases continued through the show's middle seasons, providing a comprehensive record of each episode's fuller version alongside the broadcast cut. But at some point in the show's later seasons, the pattern broke. The censorship research community that documents Family Guy's broadcast and release history has established that uncensored versions of episodes from Season 18 onward have not been publicly released, not on DVD, not through any streaming service, not through any commercial channel that has made the material available to the public. This matters in several ways. Season 18 covers the 2019 to 2020 broadcast year, which means there are now multiple seasons of Family Guy content for which only the broadcast version, the version that was edited for network television standards, is publicly accessible. Given the show's history of generating significant differences between broadcast and uncensored versions, the absence of uncensored releases for the later seasons represents a meaningful body of content that exists in a form accessible to the production company, but not to the audience. The reasons for this gap are not publicly documented. Several possibilities exist. The shift in the show's primary distribution from physical media to streaming could have reduced the commercial incentive for DVD production, since fewer households maintain DVD players and fewer viewers purchase physical media as a first-choice access method. Disney's acquisition of the Fox Entertainment assets, including Family Guy's production and distribution infrastructure, could have introduced new content standards or commercial priorities that affected how the later seasons were packaged for release. The show's declining ratings could have reduced the commercial case for premium DVD releases with extensive bonus features. Whatever the reason, the result is a gap in the show's public content record. Viewers who want to see the uncensored version of a Season 8 episode can buy the DVD or access it through the show's physical media library. Viewers who want to see the uncensored version of a Season 20 episode currently have no legitimate commercial pathway to do so. That asymmetry is not unique to Family Guy. It reflects broader patterns in how the entertainment industry has managed the transition from physical media to streaming, but it is a concrete and ongoing limitation on the root accessibility of the show's complete content history. Section 20. What the show almost became the movie that never happened. Among the most interesting items in Family Guy's content near history is the feature film that was publicly discussed for years and that never materialized. MacFarlane mentioned the possibility of a Family Guy theatrical film in a 2007 Hollywood Reporter interview, noting that he had ideas for a story that could only be told in a cinematic context, something that the episodic format of the television series couldn't accommodate. He returned to the topic in subsequent interviews, describing a concept that he characterized as an old-style musical with dialogue, comparing his vision to classic musical films in their integration of song and story. The film was announced, discussed, and speculated about for years, without reaching production. MacFarlane's characterizations of what it would be evolved over multiple interviews, sometimes emphasizing the musical elements, sometimes describing a more adventurous plot that would take the Griffins somewhere the television show couldn't reach. The involvement of the full cast was assumed. The scale of what was being proposed a theatrical release, not a direct-to-DVD special like the show had produced before, implied a production investment significantly larger than anything the television series had undertaken. The film was never made. Its development stalled at various points for reasons that were never publicly explained in detail. MacFarlane moved on to the Ted films, which were original live-action properties that demonstrated his viability as a theatrical filmmaker without the constraints of an existing animated franchise. The theatrical animated film category became more complex during the period when a Family Guy movie might have been produced. The success of animated features from Pixar and DreamWorks Animation created a standard for theatrical animation quality that a television animation spin-off would have struggled to meet or compete with. What remains is the concept imperfectly described across multiple interviews, never developed to the point of public scripting or production announcement, but genuinely considered at various points in the show's history. The Family Guy theatrical film that was discussed and not made is a specific kind of lost content. Not content that was produced and then restricted or removed, but content that was conceived and then set aside. The stories that were planned for it, the specific musical sequences that MacFarlane described wanting to create, the characters and situations that a theatrical release might have developed in ways the television format could not, all of this exists only in the form of MacFarlane's partial descriptions in interviews, and whatever remains in the files of whatever development process was undertaken before the project stalled. The Ted films, in some ways, represent the ghost of the Family Guy film. They are what MacFarlane made when the animated theatrical concept didn't happen an original animated character in a live-action context rather than a fully animated theatrical feature. The success of Ted and Ted 2 demonstrated that MacFarlane's theatrical instincts were commercially viable and that his specific comedic sensibility translated to the cinema. Whether a Family Guy film would have replicated that success, or whether the constraints of an existing animated property would have limited its potential, is a question that the show's history leaves permanently open. Section 21. Death, Consequences, and the Episodes That Dared to Matter. Family Guy's history contains a handful of episodes that attempted, with varying degrees of success, to break through the show's default setting of consequence-free comedy into territory where something felt genuinely at stake. These episodes are interesting not just as individual achievements or failures, but as data points in the larger question of what the show was capable of when it chose to try something different from its usual approach. Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is the episode most often cited in this category. It aired in May 2010 and consisted entirely of Brian and Stewie locked in a bank vault overnight, talking to each other. There were no cutaway gags. There were no other characters. There was no plot beyond the conversation itself. The episode ran at a standard length and used all of that length for two characters discussing, with more candor than the show typically allowed, their actual feelings about themselves and each other. Brian revealed, during the episode, that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box at the bank. The reason he has a gun there, he eventually acknowledges to Stewie, is that he has thought about suicide, that the gun represents a specific kind of relationship to his own continued existence that is both darker and more carefully considered than anything the show had previously attributed to him. Stewie's response to this revelation is the best writing in the episode, not platitude or easy resolution, but a specific articulation of what Brian's continued existence means to Stewie and why it matters beyond sentiment. The episode received extensive critical praise at the time of broadcast and continues to be cited as evidence of what the show was capable of when it committed fully to character-driven storytelling rather than joke delivery. It demonstrated that the voices MacFarlane used for Brian and Stewie were capable of carrying a full episode of something genuinely different from the show's standard register, that the characters had sufficient depth for a conversation to be interesting for 22 minutes without any of the usual comedic machinery operating. The episode exists as a benchmark against which other episodes can be measured, and as a persistent frustration for viewers who watched it and then watched subsequent seasons return entirely to the show's default mode, as if Brian and Stewie had not demonstrated another option. The episode proves that Family Guy could be a different kind of show. The seasons that followed proved that it chose not to be. Screams of silence. The story of Brenda Q from Season 10 represents the opposite end of the spectrum of ambitious episodes, an attempt to engage seriously with domestic abuse that generated more discomfort and controversy than Brian and Stewie did, for reasons that are worth examining carefully. The episode depicted Quagmire's sister in an abusive relationship and followed the family's attempts to help her. It was praised by some viewers for taking the subject seriously and criticized by others for the specific way it resolved the episode's ending, in which the abusive partner is killed by Quagmire, was read by some critics as a vigilante justice fantasy that did not engage honestly with the complexity of domestic violence situations. The episode remains in the show's content library without restriction, available to stream. It was never pulled or modified after broadcast. But the conversation it generated about what Family Guy was doing when it approached serious subject matter, about whether the show's comedic mode was compatible with genuine engagement with trauma, was substantive and unresolved. The episode is an example of the show attempting something beyond its usual scope and landing in contested territory, neither fully succeeding nor fully failing. These ambitious episodes, the ones that tried to be more than their format usually asked for, form their own internal category within the show's history. They are not lost or restricted in most cases. They are simply the episodes that remind you, intermittently across a very long run, that the show could make choices it usually didn't. The gap between what those episodes demonstrated was possible and what the rest of the series chose to do is one of the most interesting spaces in the show's entire history. Section 22. The show's relationship with its own legacy. Self-reference, meta-comedy, and looking backward. As Family Guy has continued into its third decade, one of its most consistent creative reflexes has been to look back at itself to make jokes about its own history, acknowledge its own longevity, and engage with the fact of its continued existence as a subject of comedy in its own right. This self-referential mode has produced some of the show's most interesting late-period content and also some of its laziest. The difference between self-awareness as comedy and self-awareness as substitute for comedy is fine but meaningful. Back to the Pilot in Season 10 is the purest expression of the show's capacity for self-reference done well. The episode sent Brian and Stewie back in time to the events of the show's pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, from January 31, 1999. Allowing the current versions of the characters to interact with the versions of themselves that existed in the show's first episode. The animation style of the original pilot was reproduced with deliberate fidelity, creating an uncanny effect when the current era characters, drawn in the show's more polished later style, moved through a version of the Griffin household rendered in the rougher visual language of 1999. The episode is funny on its own terms, but it also functions as genuine commentary on the gap between early and late-period Family Guy. The 1999 versions of the characters are visibly simpler, drawn differently, yes, but also characterized more simply. with less of the accumulated damage and complication that the subsequent decade had introduced. Peter in 1999 was recognizably Peter, but a Peter who had not yet become the specific version of Peter that the show's Flanderization had produced by season 10. Brian in 1999 was a version of Brian who still seemed to genuinely like the people around him. Watching the current era characters interact with those earlier versions was watching the show explicitly acknowledge what had been lost. Cutaway Land attempted a similar self-referential exercise around the show's most famous comedic device, constructing an episode in which Peter and Lois could literally travel between cutaway gags as if they were physical locations. The episode recycled cutaways from earlier seasons, which was either clever, using the physical presence of older jokes as commentary on their existence, or lazy, depending on how charitably you read it. The episode concluded with Peter waking to discover it had been a dream, a resolution so conventional that it amounted to the show parodying its own use of reset button storytelling, while also using a reset button conclusion. Whether the self-parody was intentional enough to redeem the conventionality of the execution is a question without a consensus answer. The show's fourth wall breaks became increasingly frequent in its later seasons, with characters acknowledging that they were animated, commenting on the show's declining quality, making jokes about Fox's broadcasting decisions, and occasionally speaking directly to the viewing audience in ways that the early seasons never attempted. Some of these moments were sharp, the specifically crafted kind of meta-joke that requires genuine self-awareness to work. Others were simply a form of preemptive self-defense, the show making jokes about its own problems as a way of acknowledging them without actually addressing them. The distinction matters. A show that acknowledges it has gotten too reliant on cutaway gags, while being itself too reliant on cutaway gags, is not thereby absolved of the problem it is acknowledging. Naming a creative limitation is not the same as overcoming it. But Family Guy's later seasons often seem to operate on the assumption that naming the problem was sufficient, that a joke about the show's declining ambition served as a substitute for ambitious comedy rather than a commentary on its absence. This is one of the more frustrating patterns in the show's late-period creative decisions, because the self-awareness that the jokes demonstrate is real and occasionally perceptive, and yet that self-awareness produces jokes rather than change. The show's treatment of its own history in these meta-episodes is also, inevitably, selective. Back to the Pilot looks back at the first episode with a combination of affection and gentle acknowledgement of change. It does not look back at the specific creative decisions that produce the character Flanderization documented in the show's middle seasons. It does not look back at the treatment of Meg with the kind of honesty that Seahorse Seashell Party briefly attempted. The self-references curated the show, choosing which parts of its own history to acknowledge and which to leave unaddressed. That selective self-awareness is itself a kind of lost content. The version of Family Guy that genuinely reckoned with everything it had done over 30 years, the character damage, the creative compromises, the gap between the show that existed and the show it could have been, is not a show that has been made. It is a show that the self-referential episodes gesture toward and then retreat from. The full reckoning is in the category of content that was approached and abandoned, not because it was banned or restricted, but because pursuing it fully would have required acknowledging things that the show preferred to leave unexamined. Section 23. The oral history that doesn't exist. What the people who made the show haven't said. The history of Family Guy that has been written is largely the history of what the show produced and how that content was received. It is the history of episodes and ratings and controversies and creative decisions as they can be observed from the outside. What is largely missing from the public record is the interior history, what the people who made the show thought they were doing, what they argued about in writers' rooms, what they were proud of and what they were frustrated by, what they tried and failed, and what they decided not to try at all. A comprehensive oral history of Family Guy has not been produced. This is not unusual for a show that is still in production. Oral histories are typically written from a retrospective position, when the participants can speak with some distance about what they created. But given the show's cultural significance and its 30-year run, the absence of a substantive public account of the show's interior creative life from the perspectives of the people who lived it is notable. What exists instead is a scattered archive of interviews, commentary tracks, convention panels, social media posts, and occasional long-form journalism that collectively provide fragments of the interior history without assembling it into a coherent whole. MacFarlane has given dozens of interviews over the years, and the aggregate of those interviews contains significant information about how he understood the show at various points in its history. The showrunners who followed him in the active creative role, Apple, Sulkin, and others, have given fewer public interviews but have occasionally discussed their work with specific candor. The writers, the voice actors, the animators, and the production staff have contributed further fragments across years of commentary tracks and convention appearances. But there are specific questions about the show's creative history that the existing public record does not answer. What was the internal conversation when the decision was made to retire the evil genius Stewie? Who in the writer's room pushed for the treatment of Meg to escalate? And who, if anyone, pushed against it? What was the actual dynamic when Fox aired episodes without MacFarlane's permission during the 2007 strike? And how did that affect the subsequent relationship between the creator and the network? What were the specific arguments for and against producing partial terms of endearment, given the obvious likelihood that the network would not broadcast it? What was the writer's room discussion around the decision to kill Brian and then immediately undo the death? These questions are answerable in principle. The people who know the answers are alive and traceable, but have not been answered in any public forum with the specificity that would make the answers genuinely illuminating. The interior history of the show's creative decisions remains largely private, existing in the memories of the people who were in the rooms where those decisions were made, and in whatever written records those rooms generated that have not been made public. This is not a conspiracy or a deliberate act of suppression. It is simply the normal situation of creative work that has not yet been the subject of the kind of systematic historical documentation that its significance probably warrants. The show is 30 years old and still being made. Its creative history is still unfolding. The people who made its most significant early seasons are still active in the industry. The conditions for a comprehensive oral history exist. What is lacking, currently, is the project that would assemble one. Until that project exists, the interior history of Family Guy remains a kind of lost content, not lost in the sense of being unavailable because it was never recorded, but inaccessible because it has never been assembled from the scattered sources where its components currently reside. The show's external history, what was made, what aired, what was cut, what was banned, is reasonably well documented. The show's internal history, what was thought, what was argued, what was tried and abandoned before reaching the screen, is still waiting to be told. Section 24. The town, the history, and the world that got built. Throughout the show's 30-year run, something gradual and largely unplanned happened in the background of every episode. The fictional world where the Griffins live accumulated enough detail to feel like a real place. Not in the way that carefully serialized fictional worlds feel real, not through sustained continuity or deliberate myth-building, but through the specific weight of detail that accumulates when a large group of creative people spend decades returning to the same locations and the same characters. The neighborhood where the Griffins live. The bar called the Drunken Clam, where Peter and his friends spend what appears to be a majority of their waking hours. The high school where Meg and Chris attend classes. The local television station where Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons and later Joyce Kinney deliver the news. The hospital where Dr. Hartman makes his reliably incompetent diagnoses. The church, the supermarket, the coffee shop. Each of these locations has accumulated a specific texture across hundreds of episodes. A history of things that have happened there. A set of associations that make them feel inhabited. The supporting cast that populates this world is as significant to its texture as the locations themselves. Cleveland Brown was one of the original four friends and eventually received his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 before Cleveland returned to the main series. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who is simultaneously the most capable and the most consistently mocked member of Peter's friend group, has a history of his own that the show has only partially explored his career as a police officer before his accident, his marriage to Bonnie and their long gestating pregnancy, his relationship with his son Kevin and daughter Susie. Glenn Quagmire, the sexually aggressive neighbor whose comedic function the show has used as both celebration and occasional critique of his specific worldview, has a family history that was developed across several episodes in ways that added genuine complication to a character who might otherwise have remained a one-note caricature. The history of the fictional town itself, its founding, its civic life, Its specific regional character as a New England community was developed in fragments across many episodes without being systematically organized into a coherent account. Episodes that flash back to the town's past show us different versions of the same locations across different historical periods, occasionally contradicting each other in ways that reflect the show's general indifference to tight continuity, but that collectively build a sense of the place having been somewhere across time. There are stories within that accumulated past that the show gestured toward and never fully told. The mythology of the house itself, the Griffin family home, is one of the richer areas of the show's accumulated world building. The house has been destroyed and restored multiple times across the show's run, sometimes through events that the show treats as permanent consequences, and sometimes through events that reset completely by the following episode. The basement, where Stewie's laboratory equipment presumably lives alongside the ordinary detritus of a family home, has been depicted inconsistently across the show's history, sometimes enormous enough to contain elaborate engineering projects, sometimes scaled more modestly to fit with the house's exterior dimensions. The logic of the space is cartoon logic, governed by what the story requires rather than by any consistent spatial reality, but the accumulated impressions of the house create a sense of a lived-in place that has weight beyond its function as a backdrop. What was built across 30 years in this fictional New England town that we are not calling by name is something more than the sum of its episodes. It is a place that exists in the imaginations of the people who watch the show across its entire run, a place with a specific atmosphere and a specific set of associations that belongs to the shared cultural space of everyone who has spent time there. That place is not in any single episode or any set of episodes. It is in the accumulation of all of them, including the ones that were cut, and the ones that were banned, and the ones that were pulled, and the ones that were never made but were developed to the point of having a shape. The full version of the world the show built exists partially in the aired episodes and partially in the lost and restricted and abandoned content that we have been moving through across all these hours. That is, in the end, the true scope of Family Guy's mysteries. Not just the specific episodes that were held back, not just the specific scenes that were cut, but the full version of a world that was being built for 30 years across thousands of individual creative decisions, most of which are visible, and some of which are lost. The visible parts are what the show is, the lost parts are what the show might have been. Together, they are the complete picture of what happens when a small, rough, brilliant, imperfect piece of animation made for $50,000 in 1998 keeps going, keeps accumulating, keeps building its world for 3 full decades and counting. Somewhere in that world, an evil genius baby is still planning something. The details may have changed over the years. The plans may have been revised, but the intention is there, underneath everything, exactly where McFarlane put it in the very first sketch he ever drew of the character. Some things, in the end, survive everything that happens to them. Section 25, the full picture 30 years of secrets, what they tell us, and why it matters. We have been at this for a long time now. Hours if you have followed along from the beginning. And the territory we have covered is genuinely large. Not just the specific items of lost, restricted, and mysterious Family Guy content, but the connective tissue between them. The production history, the network decisions, the creative choices, the labor disputes, the real-world events that collided with fictional content, the casting decisions that shaped characters more than any script could, the accumulated mythology of a world built across 3 decades without anyone fully planning what it would eventually become. It is worth stepping back now and looking at the shape of everything we have covered, because there is a shape even if it isn't the kind that announces itself clearly. The pitch pilot found in 2025 represents the beginning of the story not just chronologically, but in terms of what it reveals about the show's nature. McFarlane made something in 16 minutes and on $50,000 that had the essential shape of everything the show would become across 30 years. The characters were right. The relationships were right. The specific combination of warmth and sharp edges was right. The fact that it sat undiscovered for nearly 30 years, available in plain sight on a working animator's portfolio website, is a kind of perfect metaphor for the show's relationship to its own history. The substance was always there, accessible in principle, waiting for someone to look in exactly the right place. The banned and restricted episodes tell a different part of the story, a story about what American broadcasting would and wouldn't allow across different historical moments, and about how the same content was received differently depending on the year. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, held back in 2000 and finally broadcast in 2004, was in a different cultural context at each of those moments. Partial Terms of Endearment, banned in 2009 and still absent from American streaming in 2025, exists in yet another context, still a post-Dobbs America, in which the reproductive rights conversation has changed fundamentally from the one that made Fox uncomfortable broadcasting an episode about abortion. The episode's continued absence from American streaming is no longer just an artifact of a specific economic calculation made in a specific moment. It is a live cultural fact shaped by everything that has happened in the intervening 15 years. The turban cowboy situation introduced a new kind of problem into the landscape of content restriction, the problem of manufactured context, of misleading editing, creating a false connection between fiction and reality in a media environment where false connections spread faster than corrections. The episode didn't disappear because of what it actually was. It disappeared because of what someone made it look like. That distinction matters enormously, because it suggests that content can be made unavailable not through any quality of the content itself, but through the vulnerability of any piece of media to being misrepresented in an environment of fast-moving, decontextualized sharing. The creative mysteries, what Stewie was supposed to be, what the giant chicken actually means, what the first 3 seasons' deleted material might contain, what the unproduced Road 2 episodes might have looked like, tell a third part of the story, the part about the gap between creative intention and creative realization. Family Guy spent 30 years generating ideas at a rate that far exceeded what it could execute. The show that aired is the filtered version of a much larger body of creative material, scripts written and revised, stories developed and set aside, characters taken in directions they never fully traveled, mythologies built and then left incomplete. The lost content of Family Guy is not primarily the content that was censored or banned. It is primarily the content that was considered and not made, the stories that were begun and not finished, the directions that were explored and then abandoned in favor of whatever the show actually became. And what it became, a show sustained by economics more than creative passion, run by people who inherited rather than created it, still generating new content because the institutional machinery and the audience's nostalgia keep the system running, is itself a kind of mystery. How does something that was created with the urgency and specificity of a personal vision become something that continues through momentum alone? How does a character who was designed with extraordinary precision in a 1998 sketch become a character who, 25 years later, exists primarily as a commercial property? The answer is not one decision, but thousands of them, accumulated across 3 decades, each one moving the show incrementally in the direction of what it eventually became. The mysteries of Family Guy are, in this reading, not aberrations or accidents. They are the natural product of what happens when a creative work outlives the conditions that produced it. Every show that runs long enough eventually faces this question: what sustains a thing after the person who made it has moved on? After the original creative team has dispersed, after the culture that first received it has changed around it in ways that make its original context feel historical. Some shows find answers that work, they evolve. They find new creative energy. They discover that the world they built has more life in it than their original conception accounted for. Some shows simply continue, running on the inertia of their own existence, sustained by the economics of the system, rather than by the organic creative pressure that first produced them. Family Guy has been both of those things at different points in its history. The middle seasons, the revival era, the Brian and Stewie Road to episodes, the ambitious 2-parters, the occasional episode that proved the show could still do something unexpected, were the show finding the kind of renewed creative energy that makes continuation worthwhile. The later seasons, with their declining ratings and their escalating reliance on the show's own mythology as a subject of self-reference, have been the show running on inertia. The mystery is not which of those things is true. Both are true. The question is which of them defines what the show ultimately is. The answer, from the perspective of the full 30-year history, is probably both. Family Guy is a show that was genuinely brilliant in its first 3 seasons and genuinely mediocre in many of its later ones, and that produced genuinely excellent individual episodes scattered across its entire run. It is a show that was capable of Brian and Stewie and Road to the Multiverse and the original Stewie mythology, and also capable of the worst treatment of Meg Griffin and the laziest of the late-period cutaway-dependent episodes. It contains both of those things because creative institutions are not consistent. They are made by different people in different circumstances over different periods of time, and the full output of any institution of sufficient age will contain both its best and its worst. The lost content we have explored tonight sits mostly at the edges of this picture. The deleted scenes from the first 3 seasons, if they were ever recovered, would probably reveal a show that was trying harder than its revived version, more careful in its character work, more deliberate in its comedy, more invested in the specific relationships that made the early seasons work. The uncensored versions of the later seasons would probably reveal how much the show was still being shaped and edited for broadcast, even as it presented itself as transgressive and boundary-pushing. The unproduced stories and abandoned story directions would probably reveal a creative team that had more ideas than the show ever had the capacity to realize, and that was making choices between them under time and budget pressure that the final episodes only partially reflect. What they would collectively reveal, if assembled into a complete picture, is a show that was always more complicated than its reputation suggested. Not simply a crude shock comedy that happened to be popular, not simply a declining institution coasting on nostalgia, not simply the cautionary tale of what happens when a show stays on too long. Something more specific and more interesting than any of those descriptions captures. A creative work that has been, across 3 decades and thousands of individual decisions, many contradictory things simultaneously, and that left behind more mysteries than it will ever resolve. The pitch pilot was found. Some of the banned episodes have been restored to circulation. The deleted scenes of the early seasons remain largely inaccessible. The full oral history of what happened in those writers' rooms has not been told. The unproduced ideas remain in the minds of the people who considered them. The uncensored versions of recent seasons remain locked away from public access. The giant chicken's true nature remains unexplained. Stewie's original destiny was retired but not erased. Brian died and came back, and the show kept going, as if neither thing had quite happened. And the show keeps producing new episodes, new content, new moments that will eventually become part of the accumulated history we have been moving through tonight. Some of those new episodes will be good. Some will be mediocre. Some will generate controversies that lead to restricted availability. Some will be cut and end up on DVDs that fewer and fewer people will buy. Some will simply air and be forgotten. And some small fraction of them will be the kind of thing that makes someone, years from now, sit down to trace the history of how they got made and why they matter and what they reveal about the show that produced them. The mysteries compound. The history deepens. The show keeps going. That is, after all of this, the final answer to the question this video has been asking all along. Why does Family Guy have so many mysteries? Because it has been going long enough for mysteries to accumulate. Because it has been made by enough different people with enough different intentions that contradictions were inevitable. Because it exists at the intersection of commercial television, corporate entertainment, creative ambition, labor disputes, real-world tragedy, and the specific decisions of a creator who moved on without fully letting go. Because all creative institutions that last long enough eventually produce more questions than they answer, more lost content than they can recover, more mythology than their own storytelling can fully contain. The pilot is found, the episode is still banned. The mythology is still being built. Sleep on it. It will all still be here tomorrow. Section 26. Night thoughts on the show, what keeps people watching, and why the mysteries matter at all. There is a reasonable question lurking underneath everything we have covered tonight, and it is the question of why any of this matters. Family Guy is, in its most fundamental description, a cartoon comedy that has been on television for 30 years. Its lost content is not the lost content of high art. Its mysteries are not the mysteries of historically significant literature. The deleted scenes from its first 3 seasons are not going to change anyone's understanding of the human condition. The full version of the pitch pilot is a piece of animation history, but it is animation history in the specific register of a primetime comedy rather than a landmark of the form. So why spend hours on it? Why does the history of a show's banned episodes and restricted content and unexplained recurring gags warrant this kind of sustained attention? The answer, I think, is that the question of why any particular piece of popular culture matters is almost always the wrong question. What matters is what a piece of culture meant to the people who engaged with it, and what that engagement reveals about the time and the circumstances that produced it. Family Guy mattered to the people who watched it not as a monument, not as a work of high art, but as a consistent presence in their lives during specific periods of those lives. The jokes they memorized, the characters they developed opinions about as if those characters were real people whose choices they could evaluate. The episodes they quoted to friends and family members who immediately understood the references. That kind of deep, casual, sustained engagement is what popular culture does at its best, and Family Guy did it for tens of millions of people across 3 decades. The mysteries of that culture, the things that were almost made, the things that were made and held back, the decisions that shaped the show in directions it might not have taken are interesting for the same reason that the context of any significant piece of human experience is interesting. You understand what something was more fully by understanding what it could have been. The original Stewie mythology, if it had been sustained and developed rather than gradually retired, would have produced a different show. The uncensored first 3 seasons, if their deleted material were recoverable and available, would give us a more complete picture of the specific creative intelligence that made those seasons work. The full Weinstein early draft, if it were available in its complete form, would tell us something specific about how the show's writing process navigated the territory between edgy comedy and something that a major network would refuse to broadcast. These are not academic questions. They are the natural questions of anyone who has spent time inside a fictional world and wants to understand it fully, who has found something in a creative work that felt real in the specific way that good art feels real, and who wants to trace how it got made, what was nearly different, what was lost along the way. The mystery of the lost content is the mystery of the show itself, just looked at from a slightly different angle. Not what it was, but what it chose to be from among the things it could have been. The fact that it was a comedy that its primary purpose was to make people laugh rather than to edify or challenge or disturb does not reduce the legitimacy of this kind of attention. Comedy is not a lesser form. Making people laugh reliably is as difficult as any other sustained creative achievement. And the history of how specific comedies were made, how specific jokes were constructed and sometimes lost in the construction, is as interesting as the history of any other creative form. The banned Family Guy episodes are interesting not just as curiosities, but as evidence of where the edges of acceptable comedy were at specific historical moments. What was funny enough to survive broadcast, and what was sufficiently uncomfortable that the machinery of institutional broadcasting moved to suppress it. The show's relationship with its own past, the meta episodes, the self-referential jokes, the increasing frequency of the show using its own history as source material suggests that the people making it understand, at some level, that the history is part of what the show is. You cannot separate a 30-year-old show from its 30 years. The pilot from 1999 is not just historical background, it is actively present in every subsequent episode, as the source of the specific genetic material from which all of those episodes descended. The first version of Peter and Brian and Stewie contains the template that every subsequent version either honored or deviated from. When the show makes jokes about its own history, it is acknowledging that the history is living, that what happened in the early seasons is not over but ongoing, present in the current episodes as the standard against which they are measured and the origin from which they developed. That is what makes the lost content genuinely worth pursuing, beyond curiosity and beyond completionism. The lost content of Family Guy is the full version of the show's history, not just the broadcast history, not just the episodes that were approved and aired, but the whole complicated record of what was attempted and what was held back, and what was cut, and what was never made, and what was lost along the way. That full record tells a more honest story than the curated broadcast history alone. It tells the story of a creative institution in all its ambiguity and contradiction and imperfection, which is ultimately the only kind of story that is worth telling about any creative institution that has lasted long enough to have one. The show was made by people who cared about it, even when those people's choices were questionable. It was shaped by economics and institutional pressures that cared nothing about it, except as a revenue stream. It was changed by real-world events that nobody could have anticipated, and by cultural shifts that nobody entirely controlled. It was sustained by an audience that found something in it that was worth returning to, season after season, even as the thing they were returning to changed into something different from what they originally loved. The mysteries at the heart of it are not the mysteries of something that was hiding from us. They are the mysteries of something too large and too complicated and too long-lived to be fully visible from any single angle. Move around it. Look at it from the side, from above, from the specific angle of what was cut and what was banned and what was never made. And what you see from all of those angles together is the full shape of what 30 years of a show actually looks like from the inside. It is stranger and more interesting and more human than you might have expected from a cartoon about a guy who can't stop accidentally destroying his own house. Consider for a moment what 30 years of weekly production actually means in terms of raw creative labor. Across every season the show has run, there have been writing rooms full of people reporting to work each morning with the task of generating new material for characters who have been in continuous production since before some of those writers were adults. The cumulative hours of creative work that went into producing the show's aired content alone would be staggering to calculate. The cumulative hours of work that went into content that was developed but not produced, written but not animated, animated but not broadcast, broadcast but then restricted, add all of that to the total, and you begin to get a sense of the scale of the enterprise. Television production at this level is not so much a creative act as a creative infrastructure. The show is not made by a single person sitting alone with a blank page the way a novel is made. It is made by dozens of people simultaneously, each contributing a piece to a whole that none of them can see in its entirety at any given moment. The writer who crafts a specific joke does not know how it will be animated. The animator who brings it to life does not know how the voice actor will deliver the line above it. The voice actor who records the line does not know what visual context the editor will build around it. Each person's contribution is filtered through every subsequent contribution before it reaches the screen, and the final episode is the product of all of those contributions, in combination shaped by each individual's choices but belonging fully to none of them. In that context, the lost content of Family Guy is not the loss of any single person's vision. It is the loss of specific collaborative outputs at specific moments in the show's production history, the products of particular combinations of people working on particular problems at particular times. The deleted scenes from the first 3 seasons represent not just MacFarlane's unreleased creative output, but the unreleased creative output of the entire original team. The writers, the animators, the voice actors, the editors, all of the people whose specific contributions shaped those episodes into what they were. Recovering that content, if it were ever recovered, would not simply tell us something about what MacFarlane intended. It would tell us something about what a specific creative community produced in a specific moment of the show's history. That is the true scale of what is lost. Not just a creator's vision, but a community's labor, accumulated across a period when the show was at its most alive, most specific, and most clearly itself. The first 3 seasons were not the product of one person's genius. They were the product of a group of people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, and who were making something that none of them could have made alone. Whatever those seasons' deleted material contains is the trace evidence of that collaboration in its fullest and most generative form. It matters not because it would change the show's history, the episodes that aired, or what they are, but because it would make that history more visible, more complete, more honestly representative of the actual human effort that produced it. The show's mysteries are, in the end, the mysteries of all sustained creative collaboration. What does it produce, across years and decades and thousands of individual decisions, that is greater than the sum of its parts? What survives the inevitable drift and compromise and commercial pressure of long-form production? What was the original vision, and how much of it made it through? These questions don't have final answers. They have ongoing ones, generated continuously by anyone who cares enough to keep looking. The pilot was found. The investigation continues. And somewhere in the archives of a 30-year show, there are pieces of the answer waiting to be discovered by whoever looks in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. There is also the matter of what the audience brought to the show across those 30 years, the interpretations, the theories, the arguments, the emotional investments that transformed it from a broadcast product into something that lived in the culture beyond any individual episode or season. Fan communities dedicated to Family Guy have produced thousands of hours of analysis, debate, and creative work inspired by the show. The Lost Media researchers who found the pitch pilot, who documented the censorship history, who assembled the record of what was cut and what was restricted and what was never made, these people are part of the show's history in a way that goes beyond passive viewership. They are the historians of the thing, doing the work that the production company and the network have not systematically done themselves. Their contribution to the show's story is real and ongoing, and the discoveries they will make in the coming years are part of a story that is not finished. The show itself will end eventually. Every show ends. Whether that ending comes naturally, at a point where the creative and commercial case for continuation has genuinely run out, or artificially, through a network decision or a contractual change or some external event that nobody has yet anticipated, it will come. And when it does, the complete history of what the show was and what it contained will become possible to assess in a way that it is not possible to assess while the show is still in production. New episodes are still being made. New content decisions are still being reached. The history is still accumulating. The final shape of the thing has not yet been achieved. But the history that already exists, all of it, the aired episodes and the banned episodes and the found pilot and the lost deleted scenes and the unproduced film and the abandoned mythologies and the restricted content and the manufactured controversies and the real tragedies and the labor disputes and the creative partnerships that didn't last and the ones that did, that history is enormous, specific, and genuinely strange in ways that 30 years of familiarity have made it easy to overlook. You can watch Family Guy every night as background noise and take its existence for granted. Or you can start pulling on the threads, the way we have been doing tonight, and discover that the background noise contains, beneath its familiar surface, one of the stranger and more layered creative histories in the story of American television. Both ways of engaging with it are legitimate. But only one of them takes you to places like the portfolio website of an animator who didn't know what he was sitting on, or to a paper trail that leads back to a Mormon-owned music publisher suing over a song about needing a Jewish accountant, or to the specific moment when a country music legend became the vehicle for one of the most structurally unusual anti-jokes in the history of the format, or to the writer's room conversation that nobody recorded about whether a baby genius's plans to kill his mother had finally run their course. We will never know all of it. That is fine. The mystery that remains after everything we have found is part of the story. It always will be. And the people who keep looking, the archivists, the fans, the lost media researchers, the curious insomniacs running searches at 2 in the morning trying to find a scene they remember from a DVD bonus feature they watched in 2006, those people are doing something genuinely useful. They are keeping the history alive, filling in the gaps that institutions leave behind, building the record that will eventually allow someone to understand this show fully. It started with a man and a dog. The man was clumsy and kind underneath the clumsiness. The dog was smart and a little sad underneath the wit. That was the original shape of the thing, before everything that happened. Before the network canceled it twice and brought it back, before the ratings peaked and then fell for 20 years, before the characters changed in ways that some of them haven't recovered from, before the creator stepped back and other people stepped forward to carry what he built, before the pilot was lost for 30 years and then found on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2025, sitting in plain view on a working animator's portfolio page, the man and the dog are still there, somewhere beneath all of it. Go look, you might find something. The show has been running long enough and generating enough mystery in the process that there is almost certainly something left to find a scene in someone's personal archive. An early script in a file drawer, a piece of footage on a hard drive that nobody has thought to check. The history of this show is still being written by everyone who cares enough to write it. That includes you, here, at whatever hour this is, in whatever part of the world you are in. Your watching is part of it too. Every person who notices something, who asks a question, who remembers a scene differently than the broadcast version, suggests they are all contributing to the ongoing record of what this strange, flawed, brilliant, exhausting, occasionally wonderful 30-year cartoon actually was. That record is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. That is not a failure. It is the condition of anything real enough to matter. That, finally, is worth something. Thank you for spending all these hours here with me. If you made it through all of this, you know things about Family Guy's history that most of its 30-year audience doesn't, and that feels like something genuinely worth having. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it means these long, patient, deeply unhurried explorations can keep being made. Leave a comment with any mystery, lost episode, or piece of production history you want covered in a future video. I read every one of them. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is there, thank you for listening. Sleep well.